9/11, he's got a brilliant mind, so please, we're going to have two halves. We'll speak for an hour, quarter of an hour break, another hour, where we can have questions and you can ask anything you want, any topic you want. So, ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Andrew Johnson.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that lovely introduction. I've got to say about these lights, because is it better to leave them on or off? What do people think?
Actually, off's
Off's better? I'll leave them off then. But if somebody gets afraid of the dark, they can get up and switch them back on again. Indeed. So, yes, to add a little bit to what Chris just said, I have brought some books here, and these have been written over a number of years. I'll tell you a bit more about myself in a minute. All these books are available free in electronic form. So you go to the website checktheevidence.com, find the free PDFs link, download. I've got cards there, I've got leaflets, so if anybody wants, can't remember the website, just take one of the leaflets or cards, and you can get all the books for free. And I've also brought a copy, 4 copies of this book, Where Did the Towers Go?, written by my friend Dr. Judy Wood. This is described by Professor Erik Larson as the most important book of the 21st century, and indeed it is. 500 pages, you can have a look at the book. That's not available in electronic form. Paperbacks are, but that one isn't because of its format. I'll actually be mentioning a bit more about that because it comes into this talk. And the fact that it comes into this talk is one of the facts that hardly anybody else will talk about, even though it's provable what's involved. No, there's really myself, Richard D. Hall. What's that pinging off? Is that camera? Okay. So yeah, and if you do want to ask me any questions and you don't want to do it tonight, or you think of it on the way home or something, log on to the website, use the contact form, and you can contact me that way, and I'll try and send you any links or whatever you want. So who am I? I currently work as a tutor for the Open University in technology subjects. I tutor on 6 different modules, all technology related, about web and IT and programming and stuff. I've been working for the OU for 20 years. I'll switch this point off now. I had a UFO sighting when I was 10 years old. I've always known that there's other stuff going on in the world. So that I went through the university system, and I went and did my A-levels were maths, physics, chemistry and general studies, and then I went on to do computer science and physics at Lancaster University for 3 years. Came out of that, went into doing software engineering, so I worked for a company called GEC Electrical Projects in Rugby, then I came to Nottingham and I worked in telecommunications. Then I started working with a chap, and he sent me off to Canada, to South Korea, to Italy a few times, and I went to Japan twice as well, all to do with software development. So I'm very used to doing fault finding, technical analysis. I've done observational astronomy, for example, which most of these flat earthers haven't got a clue about observational astronomy.
Sorry about that, we'll look at it.
Yeah, well, Chris, I've talked to Chris while we're having a lovely tea, so we've talked about that already, but that's not the topic for tonight. And I've been involved in teaching and education since 1993. I developed an evening class in programming, in C programming, which I did. So I've got that technical background, and so I know the value of science. I also know now how it's been corrupted and how it's been used against us in so many ways, and that comes into tonight's talk as well. And just to let you know that a lot of sort of coincidence, I've had many coincidences, but this thing shown here on the right, that's actually a bit of hardware that we were working on for Toshiba in Japan, and I couldn't believe it. This was the last bit of paid work I did in software engineering in 2009, and when he pulled it out and showed me what he wanted to do, what it was, it said SA911 on it, which I couldn't believe, because obviously I've been involved in researching 9/11 since 2004. So I'll tell you a bit about that. So in this presentation we're going to talk about free energy. So we're going to look at what we mean by infinite energy and free energy. What does that even mean? What's something that's said about free energy devices? We're going to look at that. We're going to look at a reproduction of some of Tesla's experiments. One that you quite often hear on the internet, all Tesla's papers were taken and classified and the FBI stole them all. Yeah, that might be true, but there is still Tesla material available, and if you want, you've got sufficient expertise and you've got sufficient money, you can reproduce some of the experiments if you want to do it. It's possible. We're going to look at a little bit about Wilhelm Reich. This doesn't work, this pointer on here. We're going to look at, I've got a laser pointer, but it doesn't work on the screen. Wilhelm Reich. We're also going to talk a lot about cold fusion, which is very important. We're going to look at John Hutchison's experiments, and we're not going to talk about batteries. We're going to look at water-powered vehicles, which I was talking about with, what's your name?
Win.
Wayne, yeah, I was talking about Wayne a little bit, the introduction, before the introduction. We're going to look at Bedini motors, which appears to be with extracting energy from the ether, not magnetic motors. I'm not going to have time to cover that. Bruce De Palma and the End Machine, we're going to look at that. The deaths of inventors, and we're going to look at this fellow, Stephen Greer, who's sort of a key player in this, and he was a key player in Waking Me Up, which I'll mention a bit more about in a minute. And we're going to also, you should also understand why we don't have widespread use of free energy technology. There are several reasons for that, but they're quite straightforward. And the main reason why we don't have free energy technology in use is because it was weaponised and it was used on 9/11. And I can say that with absolute certainty. And I'll explain that as well later. And that's the bit that nobody else will talk about. Nobody in the 9/11 community will talk about it, 9/11 research community will talk about it, nobody in the mainstream will talk about it, nobody in the free energy community will talk about what happened on 9/11, which is very relevant to this whole question. Okay, you'll hear common statements about free energy when it comes up in conversation. Free energy is impossible. There is no such thing as a free lunch. You can't get anything for nothing, can you? It's obvious. We all know that. We've been taught it since an early age. Free energy is impossible because it breaks the first law of thermodynamics, which is the law of physics, which says energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Heat and mechanical work can be mutually convertible. That's one of the versions of it. There are different versions that you can read. And then you'll hear things like, if someone had created a free energy device, they'd be a billionaire. Clearly, I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? If you invented a device that you could put in your car and it would run forever without ever filling it with fuel, you'd be a millionaire, wouldn't you? Obviously you would. Everyone would want one, you know. So such a thing doesn't exist. You can't go down to Lidl and get one. Therefore, free energy doesn't exist. Everyone that thinks free energy is real is an idiot, and they're just pie in the sky, clearly. Perpetual motion is impossible. No one has demonstrated a device which produces more energy than is fed into it in some form. That is untrue. That is not true. But that's the argument you'll hear in the scientific community, you'll hear it in the pub, you'll hear it everywhere. It's not true. I'm sorry, but it isn't true. Okay? So that's kind of getting us off the starting blocks, really. You will hear the term over unity. This is when you get into sort of technicalities of some of the free energy discussion, you hear this term over unity. Now, over unity, it simply means that you get out more energy than you put in. Now, your basic kettle, for example, that uses 2 kilowatts of energy or 3 kilowatts. So if you have a device that, say, takes 1 kilowatt out of the wall outlet, and then you could plug it into 2 kettles and it would boil both those kettles at the same time, while only drawing 1 kilowatt from the wall, then you'd be getting 1 kilowatt from somewhere, wouldn't you, essentially? So that device would be over unity. Does such a device exist? Well, actually they do, but you won't be able to buy one. As things stand currently, you won't be able to buy one. But these things do exist. Not in that exact form that I've described, but in a similar amount of that. So the over unity phrase or concept comes from the fact of when you divide, I'm just trying to get my pointer, when you divide the amount of energy output by the amount of energy input, you end up with a figure greater than 1. In my example, if I have 2 kilowatts coming out, I put 1 kilowatt in, then I've got, over unity, I've got twice the energy coming out as has gone in. In physics and elsewhere, unity is another name for 1. That's just what they use in science. Unity is another name for 1, rather than saying 1. I don't know why they don't just say 1, but sometimes they don't. It is confused with perpetual motion because the idea then is that if you get this device and say it takes 100 watts to run it and you plug it back into itself, in theory it should be able to run itself with no outside power. It should run forever, right? That is also a simplistic concept, as I'll try and explain later on as I give you some more examples. So when a device can output more energy than goes into it, it should be able to run itself forever. But it doesn't quite, it's not quite that simple as you perhaps see. Now, the first sort of area that we can touch on, and this comes back, we'll talk about this again later in probably the second half, I think, we can talk about something called the Faraday homopolar generator. So Michael Faraday, who was born in 1791 and he died in 1867, he was an English chemist and physicist who studied the magnetic field around a conductor carrying a DC electric current and established the basis for the magnetic field concept in physics. He discovered electromagnetic induction, diamagnetism and the laws of electrolysis. So in other words, if you were to put something that could measure a magnetic field around this wire here going into my laptop, it would measure the magnetic field around that wire because there's an electrical current coming out of the transformer and going into the laptop. And the two go in parallel. So where you get an electric current, you get a magnetic field, and where you get a magnetic field, you can end up getting an electric current under certain circumstances. And it was Michael Faraday that first established this, hundreds of years ago, and it's all in all the textbooks and that. What is in the textbooks, but it's often ignored, is he did this experiment. He did this experiment on the 26th of December 1831, and what he did was he co-rotated a magnet and a copper disc and measured the output. You can see a sort of mock-up of this here. So it's a very simple experiment. This disc here was rotating, and he had a copper magnet there, and he wired it up to a meter, and what he ended up finding was that there was an anomalous current being generated. There was something going on in this experiment which his theories that he was developing couldn't explain. It was like an early form of free energy. Now, that's to say, that's not to say he could use it. He couldn't use it to light a light bulb or turn a motor. It wasn't that powerful. It was a very weak effect. But in theory, if he'd taken that forward and kept on studying it, he may have been able to develop some type of free energy motor. But instead, there was another type of motor developed, which involves a rotating magnet and a commutator. So this was a fixed magnet and a rotating disc, right? But essentially, modern motors use rotating magnets and a spindle, which goes around, which are attached to a spindle. So that's why we never got this. One example of why we never got this technology.
Do you know what that looks like? A little bit. Hard drive.
It does a bit, doesn't it? Yeah. That's just coincidental, but yeah, I take your point. And then another guy that ended up discovering anomalous energy effects is Nikola Tesla, and he said, one day man will connect his apparatus to the very wheelwork of the universe, and the very forces that motivate the planets in their orbits and cause them to rotate will rotate his own machinery. And Tesla's experiment showed that there was a radiant energy field. Energy is everywhere, it's all around. It's present everywhere, it just needed the right equipment to extract this energy. And sometimes you need to put an energy into a system to make the radiant energy visible. Now, physics tends to assume that energy works inside a closed system, right? And that's why they say that within a closed system, energy can neither be created nor destroyed, which is true. But the real thing is that we live in an open system where energy is being transduced into different forms all the time. It's just that the way that we view that energy is in mainstream physics and science is not complete, it's incomplete. Tesla's way of looking at energy was much more complete. So he could see that you could essentially get energy from nowhere. And the analogy I like to draw, you think of before the windmill was invented, right? You've got all this wind blowing about, and you just see this wind's blowing about, but the wind doesn't do any useful work until you make a windmill. You get those sails up, and it can be a wind turbine or something that just grinds the wheat into grain and all of that. But until somebody invented the windmill, they didn't know how to extract energy from the wind, which is flowing all around the planet all the time. Well, not all the time, but a good proportion of the time, particularly if you're up a hill or something like that. And you can draw an analogy when you find out about the ether, the so-called ether, which is this radiant energy field. And in mainstream science, I'm going off the slide, but it doesn't matter, there was talk of an ether up until the beginning of the 20th century, when they started to move away from that concept. And Einstein came in and they debunked this idea of the ether, and then you've got this thing called the Michelson and Morley experiment, which debunked this idea of an ether, right? So the ether is essentially where the free energy is coming from, as I understand it. Yes, so Tesla, he kind of knew about this.
Was it debunked because it was a dangerous concept?
Well, I think it was really, because by the 1930s, if you look at history, all the big corporations were starting to form, the big oil companies, the big pharmaceutical companies. That's when resources started to be controlled more tightly, and that's right across the board. energy, health, travel, was all being controlled by large corporations and governments. So I think that's when this idea of the ether had to be shut down. And it shut down, it was. So I'm just going to skim through and talk about a few free energy devices which have this anomalous energy output. I recommend a very good documentary. I think it's still on YouTube. It's called It Runs on Water, and I'll be playing a clip from this later on. It was broadcast on Channel 4, I think, in 1995 or 97. And one of the segments in that documentary was about this thing called the hydrosonic pump. Now, the hydrosonic pump was invented by James Griggs, I think, in the 1980s, and he was in a factory somewhere. I think he was a factory maintenance engineer or something, and it was used in the factory. There was this pressurized water system, and one of the or compressed air or something. It's explained in the documentary, and one of the pipes had broken, and this cold air was coming out of it, right? And he knew the air was cold because he knew what the source of this air was. But when he felt the end of the pipe, it was warm, and he couldn't explain this at first. And he realised, over doing several experiments, that if he pumped the water through a spindle, and then the spindle was like a centrifuge, at the boundary between the edge of the centrifuge and the tube, you'd get the water would heat up, and then you could get heat out of it. But when he did it this way, which was a totally new way of using this pump, it turned out that this thing was 125% efficient. So he was getting out, he was driving it with 200 watts, and he would get 250 watts of heat out of it, and he could measure that. And he's a scientist looked at it. Nobody could explain where this extra 50 watts out of the 200 come from. That's all explained in the documentary. And I think he even ended up selling this as some type of heating system. He did sell this, and it was 125% efficient. I don't know if he's still doing it, but you can look that up, hydrosonic pump. Back in the 1950s, this guy, Wilbert Smith, he was instructed by the boys topside. There's a whole story behind Wilbert Smith, some of which I tell in my books. You can look him up. And he developed a circuit which could extract energy from the Earth's magnetic field. Not much, you couldn't really run a device off it, but again, you could get free energy from the Earth's magnetic field. And he was given instructions on how to build that fairly simple circuit by these sort of quote-unquote aliens. He didn't call them aliens, but there's a whole story behind that. Another story that comes up in the research is Victor Schauberger. He was a forester, he wasn't a scientist, but he looked at how rivers flow and how water flows in rivers and currents and vortices can form, and then he was kind of inspired to create what he called a repulsine, which used a spinning vortex of water inside of it, and within this vortex, again, anomalous energy effects would come about. And eventually, according to documents, this was developed by the Nazis in a secret program. And if you read Nick Cook's book, The Hunt for Zero Point, he talks about how Schauberger's research was funded by the Nazis. Schauberger was then sort of persuaded to go to the US, and it looks like his technology went into the black world. I write a bit about that in my Secret Space Program book. Okay, I think I'm going to skip over that actually. I don't really do that. It's kind of done that really. And then now, I mentioned Nick Cook in the previous slide. I've got a clip of him talking about his research into anti-gravity, because anti-gravity and free energy are related. I'll play this clip in a minute, but I'm reminded that I meant to tell you about Stephen Greer. Now, Stephen Greer was an emergency room doctor, right? And he came out in 2001 and he did something called the Disclosure Project. Okay, and he said UFOs are real, there's a huge cover-up, and I've got 400 witnesses telling you, from the military, from Federal Aviation Authority, they've seen UFOs, they've tracked them, they've recovered alien bodies. He did this whole project. But the big thing that Greer said is that one of the reasons they don't want you to think UFOs are real is because of the energy system. Now, if you see a light in the sky, you know it's not a comet, you know it's not an asteroid, you know it's not a plane, you know it's not a helicopter, you know that it's some unusual type of flying object. It may have various coloured lights, it may have zoom across the sky. If you start thinking about it, you're going to say, how is that powered? How does it work? It's not a jet engine, it's not a nuclear engine, it's not a petrol engine, it's not a steam engine. How does it work? And that's what Greer argued. He argued that people that he'd spoken to had knowledge of recovered crashed spacecraft from other planets, basically, and they'd looked at how the energy system works. And it doesn't use coal, it doesn't use gas, it doesn't use any of that. It uses, for example, ether-based energy. And when Greer said that in 2000, I came across it in 2003, I thought, of course, it's obvious. It's obvious. You can't deny the reality of some of these objects, particularly when you've got landings, you've got bodies recovered. That's all covered in my knowledge book. But then Greer, for example, I won't talk much more about Greer. So when he said that, that's when I really got into this whole area. For example, when I first got into the connection in 1996, one of the first areas of research that I looked into was cold fusion, which I'm going to come on to later as an energy effect. And then when he said that was related to UFOs, I thought, yeah, of course it is. Of course it is. And that was a real light bulb moment for me back in 2003. So Nick Cook, he was sort of into this a bit, and he was looking at all these black military programs. For example, he looked at the stealth bomber program and whether there were any even more secret versions of that. And that's told in a documentary called The $1 Billion Secret, which is still online. That was produced in 1999. And then he wrote this book, The Hunt for Zero Point, which again, anti-gravity and free energy are all interrelated. So when you start looking into this free energy thing, you end up finding that there are methods of neutralising gravity, which is what happened on 9/11, which I'll show you and talk about later on. And here's a clip of him sort of mentioning some of this. It's a very short clip. Okay?
Many of these anti-gravitational experiments seem to have a common thread. We have, for example, this guy in Russia called Podkletnov, who's using spinning superconductors. We have the German research, which involves the rapid spinning of a kind of rather weird-shaped turbine to produce an anti-gravity effect. There was another German program I uncovered in southern Poland, which again used spinning. Now, what of course these have in common is this spinning factor, which according to some theorists say if you spin up this zero-point energy field that exists all around us, some weird and magical things start popping out, one of which is an anti-gravitational effect. As I said before, there's no single pathway to this anti-gravitational effect, but there do seem to be many ways of triggering it. Most seem to involve spinning, and a lot seem to involve the input of high doses of electricity.
So he was talking about what he found through research in his book, The Hunt for Zero Point. So what we're talking about, for example, is that that repulsine that I showed, wherever it was, going back a few slides, that had a characteristic, it spun at very high speed. And this hydrosonic pump, that has a high speed of rotation as well. And then some of these other devices that I'm going to come across, they actually involve high frequency electricity oscillations of a field, from either an electrical field or a magnetic field. So it's like when you start to stress the ether in some way, that's when things start to happen.
No.
Okay, so once you start, as he was alluding to there, once you start looking into this, you find there's loads and loads of different examples, a few of which I'm going to cover tonight, and many of which I simply won't have time. But the first one I'm going to look at, which you can see, this isn't free energy as such, but what you should be able to see clearly in this clip, that what you're looking at is not normal electricity. It's electricity which is of a different form. So this has been done by a chap called Carl Paulsner. He's some US guy. This clip's, it's about 15 years old or something. It's 10 years, 12 years old. So I first put this presentation together back in 2010. So this presentation is 13 years old now. I've modified it a little bit, but not much. So there have been a number of reproductions of some of Nikola Tesla's experiments. A number of interesting videos have been posted on YouTube. Some of them are just rubbish, but this one isn't. They've reproduced the wireless transmission of power, which Tesla called this radiant energy. There's a few reproductions of that. And here we're going to see a 100-watt bulb illuminated in water. This is underwater, as you'll see. It is a different type of energy which is lighting the bulb. It's not ordinary electric current flowing from the battery down a wire, or from powered source down a wire. So it's not in itself free energy, but it shows and proves how energy can be transferred in unconventional ways. And this experiment is over 100 years old.
Good afternoon. I'm going to show you a few things that Tesla has sent to us many years ago. Out of his lectures, books, on page 134, figure 19, you'll see the circuit right here. And also the same circuit can be found in his book, The Innovations, Research and Writings of Nikola Tesla. In this book here, it's found in several places. The one we're going to be demonstrating today will be on figure 183. Also, I've gained some of this information from Jerry Vassalato's book, Lost Science, and his other book, Secrets of Cold War Technology. Both are invaluable. Here you'll see my setup. It's 2 copper rods connected across the top with another copper rod that is on a slidable scale. I can slide it up and down. I have lowered it from the higher position today just so you can see it on the film. My camera is not quite tall enough to catch the whole thing, but it's slides up and down. It's just 2 parallel bars of copper. At the bottom of there is capacitors, just like he says in his book, and the spark gap in the front here, powered by a 10,000 volt transformer at the back. And I'll be connecting light bulbs across the bars on these 2 slidable points, both of which are independently slidable. All light bulbs are 110 volt bulbs. The only little bulb will be this bulb right here, which is a 12 volt light bulb. That's for out of an automobile type bulb. And this fluorescent tube here, I don't think it has a voltage rating on it. And we also have this big fluorescent tube over here. So I'll turn the machine on now. Arc is quite loud, so I won't be talking during this part of the demonstration.
exactly how that works, but that is another form of electricity, another way of transferring energy into that bulb, which is not like this wire up in here. That's basically the whole point of me showing that clip. Okay, so another guy that you can do some research into if you're not familiar with him already is Wilhelm Reich. Now, you know, Wilhelm Reich's work. I mean, you could do like weeks of presentations on Reich. He's an amazing guy. I'd never heard of him until about 2004. Now, he discovered a form of energy which he called orgone, and this seems to be like a life force energy. It might even be the same thing as ether energy for all I know. Some people say, no, that's wrong, but you could call it etheric energy, as I called it, zero-point energy or vacuum energy. May all be the same thing. But Wright came across this in relation to his studies in human sexuality, because he was actually, as it says here, he was an assistant of Sigmund Freud, the famous psychologist. Now, Freud said that the libido, the sexual drive, that was just all psychological. It was all in the mind, and there was no real physical element to it. But Reich, through experiment, disagreed. And he said that there was this libido energy was physically real, and you could actually measure it, with a meter or whatever. And he then went and studied this life force energy, and he constructed and conducted experiments with what are known as orgone accumulators. And you can look this all up. And he used them to treat illnesses over a period of years. And so what I'm going to do, you can read the text if you want, but I'm going to get this guy, Dr. Eugene Malov, to talk about Reich for a couple of minutes. And I'll talk a bit more about Malov shortly, and he's a very key figure in some of what I'm going to talk to you about later on.
Wilhelm Reich, the brilliant man that he was, an unusual man, because remember, he did come out of a sexual psychiatric orientation, right?
Yes.
Freud. So who is some person like that to say anything about physics?
Right.
Well, in 1941, brilliant fellow that he was, he brought some interesting observations to Einstein. He actually had 4.5 hours with Einstein. And by the way, this meeting is virtually absent from all accounts of the biography of Einstein.
Why? Because
Reich was later disparaged. He died in prison, remember?
Yeah, okay.
He turned into, just like cold fusion, an insane pathological man.
Do you think Einstein took some ideas from him?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Einstein, he asked Professor Einstein, a colleague, of course, in the fight against fascism. Remember, this was early 1941, before the United States got into the war.
Right, okay.
Of course, both of them were opposed to the Nazis, obviously. And
well aware of what was
well aware of the possibility. So Einstein, to his credit, felt that all possibilities should be explored in the possible quest to find ways to deal with perhaps war technology and what have you. His letter later on to President Roosevelt obviously helped the Manhattan Project get going.
Mm-hmm.
But here was Reich showing him a simple experiment whereby a mercury thermometer, very accurate mercury thermometer, on the surface of what we call a Faraday cage, a steel enclosure, was higher and remained higher throughout the day than a similar mercury thermometer suspended in air. Okay, now this sounds, your listeners even who don't know about this may say, well, that sounds crazy. What could that possibly show? Well, careful experiments by Dr. Paulo and Alexandra Correa in Canada confirming this type of experiment, and in fact, giving it an even worse bias against being seen. In other words, not having the orgone accumulating layers of material around the Faraday cage, just using bare steel boxes, so to speak. In their laboratory, they had found persisting, round-the-clock, elevated temperatures on the metal Faraday cage, even in a darkened room. Now, when I first saw their ether motors and their PhD, I was obviously motivated to go back and study Reich. Prior to that, I had no interest in Reich. But I wondered, could Einstein have missed in 1941 a profound discovery? And the answer is absolutely yes.
Yeah.
We covered this in our issue 37. I repeat, confirmed that there was a 0.3 of a degree or more elevation on the Faraday cage. But his assistant, Einstein's assistant, Leopold Infeld, poo-pooed it. He did some half-baked experiments to suggest that, oh yes, the simple explanation as to why this elevated temperature is there, and he pushed Einstein away from thinking about it, and thus broke the connection, the critical connection between Einstein and Reich, which if it had persisted, and if Einstein had behaved himself and continued the correspondence, Reich did write many letters, technical letters, to Einstein, pleading with him to reevaluate the assertions, the glib assertions of Leopold Infeld.
So, Eugene Mallove, he basically worked at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he found out that what I'm going to show you about cold fusion, that his own university had lied about it. They'd actually fraudulently tried to suppress cold fusion. And when he found that out, he left and he formed his own organisation looking into free energy. And that's when he came across the work of Wright, and that led him on to talk about that, what you just heard, on Coast to Coast in 2003, I think that was, which is about when I started listening. He used to be the chief science writer at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He had 2 degrees, as you can see there. And that's a bit about
the... Alexander Correa have in their laboratory done many further experiments to clarify some of the many confusions that Reich himself had about this. They have established the irrefutable presence of an ether, a mass-free ether that can be analyzed with thermometers, electroscopes, which shows that it is possible to make little motors that work on it. Earlier, they had this patented technology that I referred to called the PAGD, which has 3 U.S. patents, 1 Israel patent, and so forth, that has had pulses occurring in vacuum between aluminum plates in a glass cylinder and produce more energy out than in.
Would you say that this ether is a normal occurrence in the universe?
It is,
and it's a natural thing?
It's the foundation of the universe. There is no other foundation of the universe. The myth of relativity, and relativity is wrong, it is incorrect. Indeed, its equations describe certain experiments, accelerator experiments, very accurately, there's no doubt about that.
And outcome, I guess, right?
But the theory can be wrong. In other words, an equation can give you a very precise match between an experimental result in an accelerator, as an example, and the theory. But that does not mean that the theory is fundamentally correct. In fact, it is fundamentally absolutely wrong. There is no such thing as non-simultaneity and so forth. It's all, unfortunately, a myth. As far as advanced spaceflight, we'll seriously have to revise the Starflight Handbook somewhere.
And what does it do in terms of speed, Eugene?
There's no limitation on speed. The myth of no massful object could go faster than the speed of light is just that. It's a myth. It's observed in accelerators that you have to put more and more energy in to accelerate electrons. There's no doubt about that, okay? And you do reach a limitation if you're accelerating electrons with the kind of way they do it in accelerators. But fundamentally, there is no limit for a spaceship made out of mass, okay, namely us or a rocket ship, to go as fast as we would ever particularly want it to go. There's another myth of relativity. The twin paradox is also a myth, okay? It is just wrong. The time dilation is not part of the universe. It just isn't. No matter how many times they will tell you about muons changing their decay patterns coming through the atmosphere and so forth, and this proves supposedly time dilation, they can say it as long as they want, but there is no such thing. Now listen, since there is no such thing as space-time, which is this combined entity that came out of special relativity, there can be no such thing as a warped space-time that gives you black holes or gives you a singularity such as Stephen Hawking talks about or others in cosmology talk about. This has gotten into complete megalomania and insanity. But let me tell you, the joke, the cosmic joke of all time is on late 20th century and early 21st century modern physics, because history will record that they went off on a tangent with relativity and special and general, and they completely fooled themselves, while at the very same time making fun of such things that were giving them a hint as to the alternate physics, namely low-energy nuclear reactions, ether energy, what Reich came up with. These people ought to go back to Science 101. Science 101 is this: experiment always overrules theory.
So you can hear that Malov was basically rejecting a lot of the fundamental science that he'd been taught. You know, he had 2 degrees. He used to work for Massachusetts Institute of Technology as a science writer, so he was basically rejecting much of what he'd discovered because of what he discovered, much of what he was taught because of what he discovered about cold fusion. Now, to explain this diagram that's on the screen a little bit, this again is what Wright developed an orgone accumulator, and he found that this ambient orgone energy, you could kind of manipulate it, and you could get it to accumulate in a space if you had layers of organic and inorganic material surrounding a chamber. So you'd have fiberglass and then steel wool, fiberglass and then steel wool, and inside the chamber you would get this orgone energy accumulating, and that was what you could then use to treat people. And again, you can read up on that. Of course, science is a load of rubbish, it's just placebo, there's nothing to it, but it's much more complicated than that. Now, I'm going to play another clip in a minute. I've got quite a lot of video clips in this because, you know, I'm just a speaker. I haven't really done, there's only 1 or 2 experiments I've done with free energy type stuff. But this guy, John Hutchison, he was doing it for years. He started doing it in the mid to late 70s. And John Hutchison, who I spoke to, is still on Facebook. He's still around. You can go and connect with John on Facebook if you don't mind using social media like that. He's on there. He's a real eccentric character. He likes to dress up as a woman. But that doesn't invalidate any of his experiments.
Is this the Canadian guy, that
Correct.
Dr.
Yes, correct, yes. So
Dr. Woods,
Dr. Woods mentioned him in the book.
Yeah.
Yes, he's very relevant to what happened on 9/11, his research and experiments. So he's been doing experiments with electrostatic and magnetic fields, microwaves and radio frequency generators. In certain combinations and at certain times, John has produced jellification of metal, bending and fracturing of metal, lift, levitation and disintegration, lift as in anti-gravity, another name for it, transmutation, that's one metal changing into another, fuming, I'd like to remember these two, lift and transmutation for later on, fuming, not necessarily smoke, disappearance of samples, some of his samples just literally just disappeared, fusing of dissimilar material, and you'll see that I think in this next clip that I've got, which is a clip of me talking to him on the phone on a radio program when I was in Washington DC in 2008, which again, that whole program is on the internet if you want to listen to it. So this thing is me talking to him, and I've got a video clip from another video playing with his stuff in it while I'm talking to him. You've obviously been playing with this for a long time, and I know you've been through the wars, you know, at various times with having your equipment confiscated and things like this. I mean, that I believe that's happened at least twice. Is that correct?
No, main time was 1990 when I was in Europe. It was the Canadian government that took the entire laboratory and tried to make a secret operation, but newspapers found out about it and published the news.
Okay.
And yeah, that was that had been raided before in 2000.
Okay. And one of the things that you know, we wanted to just check with you, that I believe it was in 1983. There was a person called John Alexander, Colonel John Alexander, in fact, who'd come to see you because he'd learned about what you were doing. I wondered if you could sort of mention a little bit about that.
Oh, yes. Colonel John Alexander was 1983. He came with a team from Los Alamos, and he said to me that we're expecting a threat from, as I recall it, a threat from the Soviet Union.
Okay.
and that was a concern for the American government. So I gave a demonstration for about 4 months working with the team, and unfortunately there were some effects that happened, and sometimes it didn't. It seemed like the equipment was sabotaged, and I learned from yet another lieutenant colonel that a fellow by the name of Bob sabotaged the entire project. So John Alexander was a little upset over that, and he brought in another team from McDonnell Douglas to do a clear, not classified report, which I still have that report. And then after that, of course, the Canadian government did their experiments and kept it a matter of national security.
Of course. Now, I think that's, really interesting that we do know that people in the military are well aware of what you've been doing. It's not as if you have been, working away totally as like a hermit. They're fully aware of what you've been doing. Mm-hmm. And we understand one of the key things is that in many cases when you start your experiments, you can switch off the power and the effect that you're generating will continue.
Well, we're trying to do a parallel here, I believe, and when I switch off the equipment, sometimes there's metal samples that have been analyzed by the Max Planck Institute that seem to be accelerated in time, ahead in time.
Wow.
And the crystalline structures are always changing very fast, and the magnetic properties are changing extremely fast. So this is in regards to when I basically shut down the power, these samples, which are many of them, tend to alter.
Right.
Ongoing. The energy in the equipment has been measured at 100 to 400 watts. And when I was giving a demonstration for Maine News, the newscaster accidentally chopped the extension cord in half by accident and shut down the entire lab. So that's around 400 watts, the lowest power. And if I'm using more modern equipment, of course, I'm up to maybe 1,000 watts energy to drive the systems and that. The mayor of this city came here, and he's, a couple of years ago, talking with me, a friendly fellow, Mayor Wright of New Westminster, and he was talking about, he's giving reports of concrete cracking up, as well as citizens in distress. And it seems when I do an experiment like I did for National Geographic TV and Film, I blew out the elevator, so they couldn't get their equipment down after the experiment. And just recently, for Fox TV, I was doing an experiment, and then some plumbing exploded downstairs. But I take in consideration, too, that when I was doing the McDonnell Douglas experiments, that we had a water main explode out in the street. So that's written up in some of the text. So I've been through a lot of mischief.
I think one point I wanted to just dwell on for a second is that Judy and I we watched the internet forums quite closely, and there are quite a number of people who are saying, oh, John Hutchison can't reproduce the effects which he's makes, mm-hmm. and I wondered what your response would be. I almost feel silly asking the question, but I
think honestly, I think they don't listen to radio or watch TV or read books, because I've been doing this quite regularly for Fox TV in 2000 and onward up for Griffin Productions, as well as National Geographic TV and Film, and onward with many, many different crews have come and gone out of here, and I can sit down, turn everything on, and guarantee an effect within 5 minutes. So whatever they're reading is maybe so old that they just don't bother researching. That's what I feel.
So you see that we'll come back to John Hutchison later, because his research comes into what happened on 9/11. I'm not going to cover the crystal batteries, I haven't really got time, that's a fairly minor thing anyway. Anyway, John basically produced these batteries, which would be, I think one of them lasted for about 15 years before it's still producing power after 15 years. It was only outputting like a couple of hundred milliamps, a very small current. It was able to collect together crystals and ores and put them into a battery and arrange it in a certain way. In this video clip he explains the idea behind it, but they're not very reliable. I think only 1 in 10 that he actually made will produce any kind of useful output. So it's not reliable. Let's see. So I think I'm going to play this clip now, and then we'll have a break after this. Now, this is really important because back in 1989, free energy nearly became mainstream, and it was to do with something called cold fusion, which in summary is an energy effect. Now, you've probably heard of nuclear energy. Well, there are actually two types of nuclear energy, two main types. One is called fusion, and one is called fission. And if you look at what those words mean, fission is breaking and fusion is joining. So the way that a conventional nuclear power station works, like the ones that produce all this horrible waste, that's by fission. You break atoms up, and in the breaking of the atom, a small amount of matter within the atom is converted into energy, according to Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. That bit appears to work because it produces this very large amount of energy. Fusion is where you force two small atoms to go together to make a bigger one. Or two nuclei, I should say, to form a bigger nucleus, and that's fusion. Normally that's a very complicated process. They recently did another go round, I think just before Christmas, where somewhere in the US they're claiming that they've now got more energy out from a fusion reaction they put in, like a nanosecond or something. They've been claiming this, that viable fusion energy is always 20 years in the future. And it's been that way since the 1950s. And I did a lot of posting on this just before Christmas. But these two chemists, they said, hang on, we've got something that looks like nuclear power, but we're doing it in a little beaker of basically water with two electrodes. It's what's called an electrolysis experiment. Electrolysis, electrode is electricity, lysis means breakdown. So electrolysis is breakdown using electricity. And I remember from my chemistry that an electrolyte is a solution which, when molten or in solution, electrolytes are substances which, when molten or in solution, will conduct an electric current and be decomposed by it. That's from my A-level chemistry class. So these two guys, they knew all about that, and then they developed this technique.
Water itself is quite a mysterious and powerful substance.
Given enough time, it can erode steel and rock. It is composed of hydrogen and oxygen, two of the most reactive elements on Earth. Science has also known for over 200 years how to extract hydrogen and oxygen gas from water through the process of electrolysis. It was from this field of electrochemistry and not nuclear physics that there emerged a revolutionary idea of a new kind of fire from water. In the 1980s, Fleischmann and Pons used their own money to conduct experiments for 5 years. They passed a current through an electrochemical cell containing heavy water, or deuterium oxide. One of the electrodes, the negatively charged cathode, was made of the precious metal palladium. The electrical current separated individual deuterium nuclei, or deuterons, from the heavy water and forced them to pack tightly into the palladium cathode. What happened next inside the palladium at the atomic level remains a mystery and became the subject of intense debate. Whether it was actual nuclear fusion or some other as yet unknown phenomenon, the result produced far more excess heat energy than any known chemical reaction. Why is such a phenomenon so astonishing? Why did it provoke such outrage in the physics community? To most classically trained physicists, the concept of low-level nuclear reactions producing significant heat energy was inconceivable.
It was a very unfortunate time to make such an announcement for various political reasons, really. The situation in the United States, the situation with regard to the program in hot fusion. That was against it. But also, of course, was the fact that we were not ready to make such an announcement. The criticism of pathological science is one which has quite frequently been leveled at unusual investigations, which admittedly sometimes are at fault. However, there is also the situation that people will criticize a field long after they should really have given up. And that is pathological criticism. They just get trapped in a situation. They have made a criticism. They have to maintain that criticism against all the evidence.
At Texas A&M, a group led by Professor John Bockris, who is widely regarded as one of the world's greatest electrochemists, reported finding the hydrogen isotope tritium, a key signature that some unusual nuclear reaction was going on.
The first thing was this thing called tritium, which is a sub-form of hydrogen which should not exist except in extremely tiny quantities. We found that by working these cells of Fleischmann and Pons containing lithium hydroxide and deuterium oxide, that we could produce this tritium in great abundance. Let's say at 10,000 times more than it ought to be there, as it were. And let me stress that we couldn't do it every time, but about one result in 5 or one result in 4, and eventually we worked up to 2 results out of 3. We could produce tritium. That was the first thing, and in a way it was the first clear proof of the phenomenon.
At Texas A&M, Bockris's group found themselves under attack. Science magazine writer Gary Taubes wrote a stinging article that insinuated that someone in the group had spiked the samples with tritium. Although unfounded and eventually proved untrue, the allegation effectively dampened Bockris's remarkable claims.
Well, I was 69 years old at that time, and I took the attitude, suppose they fire me, right? It doesn't really matter. I'd had my career. The worst they could do would be to say, go, your tenure is withdrawn. And therefore I wasn't frightened. And I went on saying the truth and publishing what we'd got. But finally the university revolted against this. And they set up an inquiry, as they called it, rather sinisterly. The accusation was that I had carried out misconduct of research, you see, that I shouldn't have worked on these things. And they decided that the accusations were totally groundless, and they published all this. But then they started all again about 6 months later, and they had another committee. It was this time, when my lawyers asked the university what the second inquiry was about, they were told, it's an ad hoc committee. What's that? We have nothing further to tell you. And so this went on for 11 months of constant meetings and inquiries and so on. And I'm quite sure that they were trying to find an excuse to end my tenure, you see. Finally they came out okay. I mean, they gave me another letter. I'd had the letter of complete exoneration. This time it said that they had spent this 11 months and had found that I had never done anything, the phrase used were, that contravened the rules of procedure of this university, or something rather formal and stuffy like that. But I think the main part was that I had done work which was against the paradigm, and that was what they were really upset about. You know, people said that they'd been to other universities and people had laughed at it and said, what the heck are you doing, trying to disprove the laws of nuclear physics? And of course that's exactly what we were doing, and succeeding, you see.
Even though positive results were still coming in, the Department of Energy's negative report effectively killed congressional funding in the United States. Fleischmann and Pons later packed their bags and left for France to carry on private research sponsored by the Toyota Corporation.
By 1992, we had video recordings of intense energy release. By the summer of 1994, we had demonstrated sustained energy release. That, of course, if you say you wish to make this into a device, required further research. And we were always working on a time frame of trying to get to that point by about the year 2000. And I think that if the resources had been available, we would have got to that particular point, probably before the year 2000. But this did not happen.
Yet as early as 1992, cold fusion experimenters began reporting unusual appearances of trace amounts of different metals, such as copper, silver, chromium, and zinc when examining their spent cells. Rechecking for possible contamination, scientists like Bockris and Miley confirmed that indeed new metals and isotopes were being formed, transmuted, during the process which produces excess heat.
Kevin Wolf made many measurements of tritium. Then he got some even more astonishing results as early as '92, which were these transmutational results, the metal forming another metal inside the electrode, you see, which was super anti-paradigm. You know, there's that dreadful word alchemy, which we mustn't use, but it was a form of that in a way, that was creating new metals, you see.
In Japan, Tadayoshi Omori and Tadahiko Mizuno at Hokkaido University have produced volumes of data under rigorously designed experiments showing the production of metals ranging from iron to platinum and beyond. The Omori cell using a tungsten cathode has consistently produced excess energy along with measurable amounts of transmuted metals.
So that's really significant that they were actually finding after their experiments. For example, they got zinc in the experimental cell. There was no zinc in there before. Where did that zinc come from? New metals are not meant to be created inside an closed experimental system. This was why they went after Bockris, because he was getting results which science couldn't explain. And he was he wasn't in some garage somewhere, he was in the university. He was a paid academic. And as you'll see shortly, I forget exactly what man in this clip I've got later, but there's this character that comes into this story called Stephen E. Jones. There might be one or two of you in the room that have heard of this guy. This Stephen E. Jones guy, he wrote to me in 2005. That's another story. It wasn't about cold fusion though. I didn't know he was involved in cold fusion. So I think what I'm going to do, so I think we'll find out about Stephen E. Jones after the break. It's now 8:05. So I think it's time for a break for an hour, 15 minutes.
Yeah, we'll take a 15-minute break now. We'll allow like a... Yeah, just a few questions. Are there any urgent questions about what we've heard so far that we would like to ask? I just want to ask, you know, I've got like a water purifier, and there's a device called a TDS meter which can detect total dissolved solids. When they were proving that guy wrong, then he spiked the water, couldn't they have
I think they well have used something like that to disprove the journalist's claim. And this is what happens, you know, a journalist can just go like that. Gary Taubes, he decided to put out a story about them spiking the test tube. He could have just as easily said to Bockris, have you stopped beating your wife yet? You know, and put that in an article. Okay. It didn't really matter, he just had to cast doubt on Bockris's character. His team's character. It didn't really matter that he was saying it was to do with tritium being spiked. I mean, that would work better in that instance. But he could have put any old... It's the same as what they're doing with Richard P. They'll just put some claptrap out, you know, that's vaguely plausible, and then they'll use it to try and discredit the person who's going against the paradigm, as Bockris was. So I'll put the lights up again, and got even darker. So I mentioned in the first half this character called Stephen E. Jones. Okay, now Stephen E. Jones, he actually invited me to join a group called Scholars for 9/11 Truth. Okay, which I'll come on to in a bit. But when he invited me, I didn't realise that Stephen E. Jones was involved in cold fusion research.
Since Pons and Fleischmann were both well aware of the pitfalls of premature publicity, why would they bypass the accepted conventions of the peer review system and announce their discovery through the media?
I was thinking, these guys are no fools. They know what they're doing. These are good scientists.
Prior to the 1989 announcement, Stephen E. Jones, a physics professor at nearby Brigham Young University, learned of Pons and Fleischmann's work through an informant at the DOE. In a flagrant example of shameless opportunism, Jones insisted on going public quickly with his comparatively much less clear results. Disparaging the excess heat claims of Fleischmann and Pons, Jones' announcement would have effectively prevented the two scientists from patenting their process, a process they had developed on their own over long years of research. On the advice of university attorneys, Pons and Fleischmann, feeling their backs to the wall, reluctantly delivered their work to public scrutiny.
So Jones was actually involved in getting Pons and Fleischmann's research shut down, getting the funding removed so that he couldn't continue. This is Dr. Stephen E. Jones of Brigham Young University. Basically, he'd been doing research into another process called muon-catalyzed cold fusion. And in fact, it was Stephen E. Jones and his colleague Paul Palmer that invented the name cold fusion. Pons and Fleischmann didn't like that name because they didn't know if it was cold fusion. It was Jones and his colleague that came up. It was kind of like a joke within science, this name of cold fusion. They wanted to call it low energy nuclear reactions. That's because that's a bit of a mouthful. So that name didn't stick. And he was on the scene in 1989, but Stephen E. Jones, he came onto the 9/11 research scene in 2005, right? August 2005 to be precise. And I think the reason why he came onto the 9/11 research scene then was because in 2005, the National Institute for Standards and Technology released 10,000 pages of documents about the destruction of the World Trade Center. And anybody who studied those documents could have found out that there was something very odd about what happened to the World Trade Center. And Jones, he said in 2005, the official story of 9/11 is wrong. It wasn't hijacked planes. Somebody planted thermite in the towers, and that was used to burn them down, dissolve the steel girders, and that's how it was destroyed. That explanation is false, and Jones knew it was false. And you're going to see what relationship 9/11 had to cold fusion a little bit later. So here's another clip of Jones.
Is it a shortcut to fusion energy? I don't want to disappoint anyone. I think I'll put my read my lips answer here, and then I'll carry that. I think that'll become clear why I'm saying that. Can you read my lips on that back in the back? It says no. Energy is a long way off. That's why I say no. This is our result. It's just way off. I think a door that's open to us, but really a door on physics more than on energy. Geophysics in particular could be an interesting area.
So Jones says, yeah, cold fusion is real. You're not going to get any energy out of it, so just forget about it. You won't get any free energy from cold fusion. Just forget about it, just ignore it, go away. Jones worked for Los Alamos National Laboratories, and he did work for the US Department of Energy. Do you know what went on at Los Alamos National Laboratories, anybody?
Did the animal test?
You can't answer, you've seen this presentation before. Sorry, go ahead. What were you saying?
Well, there was an animal test, wasn't there?
Yeah, that's where they developed the atomic bomb at Los Alamos. And this Jones character worked for Los Alamos. Not on the atomic bomb.
The first time I found it. Tomb Raider.
Oh, right. Tomb Raider. So cold fusion, it seems the whole affair was managed from start to finish. The goal was to trash and debunk the science. In fact, the Open University used cold fusion as an example of bad science. They put it in one of their courses, and one of the students wrote to me and told me about it, and I had to write to the course team and say, look, this is not bad science, you don't know what you're talking about. Take that out of the modular materials. No response. So I don't work for that branch of the OU. So it was the first time that the phrase pathological science was used in science and was brought to general use. That's the phrase that Bockris talks about. And the people I speak to today recently have said their results have never been reproduced. That's a lie. Bockris reproduced them. Teams in Japan reproduced them. You only have to read Eugene Mallard's book, Fire from Ice, that I briefly mentioned. You can get that, a 1991 Pulitzer Prize winner. It was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. You can read about the whole reproduction of cold fusion across many universities. Okay? But it was difficult, and it still is difficult, to reliably reproduce the conditions under which the effects that Bockris described were seen. In fact, he said they could only get positive results 2 in 3 experiments, something like that, or less. Different reproductions have different results in terms of getting more heat out than you put in, evidence of nuclear processes, that's neutrons and tritium, and or transmutation of elements. You don't always get all of those effects, sometimes you don't get any. Different experiments produce them in different amounts and in different ways. It's still a bit of a mystery in the white world. It's not, however, a mystery in the black world. And we now know that. So we're now going to talk about Brewster Palmer. Now Brewster Palmer, he studied electrical engineering at Harvard and and he graduated, I think, in 1958. So he taught physics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology for 15 years, and he worked under Harold Eugene Edgerton. He was also employed by Edwin Land of Polaroid. He is the brother of the Hollywood film director Brian De Palma, who produced that scary film Carrie in the early 70s, if anybody saw that, with the shock ending. In his study of inertia, he developed a kind of rotating magnetized gyroscope, which was based on the Faraday experiment that I showed you near the beginning of the presentation, the homopolar generator. And he developed this thing called the N machine, and I've got a clip about that here.
Right now we have entrenched energy monopolies and cartels. You know, we have OPEC and we have the 7 sister oil companies that control all the oil and energy. But what people have to understand is that the people who run the energy business in this world, which is the biggest business on the planet, turning over $4 to $5 trillion a year, it's bigger than guns and drugs, it's bigger than defense. They control the newspapers, they control the governments. But these companies are so big that they regulate the government, which regulates them.
In 1977, Bruce De Palma unveiled the first prototype of the N machine, an electrical generator which uses rotating magnets to generate up to 5 times more power than it takes to drive it.
I know about the fact that the Japanese government and the Indian government have ongoing projects to produce N machines for domestic power. My partner is Paramahamsa Tiwari, who is the director of the Nuclear Power Corporation of India, which operates all the nuclear plants in India.
In late 70s, I learned from Bruce De Palma that he had carried out certain crucial experiments by rotating electromagnets.
Tiwari tested a prototype based on De Palma's N machine under laboratory conditions. The results were deemed too impressive, causing disbelief and suspicion among conservative government officials and the power consortiums that backed the project. Tiwari was forced to abandon the project completely.
One of the pivotal people that I encountered early in my career was Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut.
Edgar J. Mitchell, an Apollo mission astronaut, founded the Noetics Institute in Southern California. The Institute's charter was supposedly to develop alternative energy systems by attracting inventors from all over the country. Mitchell became extremely interested in De Palma's N machine. He made De Palma a paltry offer to buy out the invention, which De Palma naturally refused.
He said to me that if I ever tried anything on my own in California, I would get my head blown off. So I was scared to death. The CIA operates through various very innocent-looking fronts to find out what people are thinking and what they're inventing. Now, what's more innocent than a benign institute founded on transcendental principles to help New Age inventors bring free energy into the world?
And that situation still exists in the United States today, where a person that really understands what's going on just can't get their idea out because the alternative science and medical fields have been co-opted by the intelligence services.
And he converted this little engine to run on water. This is many, many years ago. And he used it for several years. And somehow the news got out, and one day he got visitors, and he was told to dump the engine or else. 3 weeks later, the man was dead. And the coroner's finding was that he fell off the back of a train. He was drunk. Now, it happened that he didn't drink.
There is no progressive science in a world where every scientific idea is evaluated for its military potential.
Power, or energy, control of energy equals power in the new world order that is emerging. If you control the energy, the way we get around, the way we get electricity, the way we have our TVs and video cameras and stuff, if you do the control of the energy, then you've got control of the people.
So we're going to revisit some of those things a little bit more in this second half. But you'll know what Bruce De Palma said about Edgar Mitchell. He said, if you're going to do your research in California, you're going to get your head blown off. Now, Edgar Mitchell was visited by Bart Chabrel and challenged over his supposedly walking on the moon. And Edgar Mitchell's son is heard to say in that video clip from the film that Bart Sibrel made, shall we call the CIA and have him waxed? Now I've got another clip in another presentation where Edgar Mitchell admits that he worked for the CIA in the 1970s. Yeah, this is somebody who founded this institute founded on transcendental principles. So you're getting a glimpse now of how the cover-up of free energy works, and there'll be more in a bit.
Who was this institute? What was it?
IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences. It's still going today. Still going today. So what happened to Bruce de Palma? Well, this was not a surprise considering the condition that I had been seeing Bruce in when I visited him in December 1993. Bruce began each day upon arising, sometime before noon, with fine wine mixed with sparkling water. Years of alcohol and substance abuse finally took its toll. The mystique and enigma that encircled the life of Bruce de Palma was due in part to the fact that he was never able to prove his theories with a working over-unity device. That's one of the stories you'll read about Bruce de Palma. That he died because he was an alcoholic. Really? Do you think that's true? I don't know if that's true or not. But what I can tell you is that there are videos of that end machine which were filmed in 1980 by the Borderland Science Foundation. You can see the whole thing working, you can see it hooked up to meters. And you can see, for example, that it was producing hundreds of amps out of it and very low voltage. It's a very unusual energy profile that produces. And we saw that Peter Tiwari, this Indian guy, he reproduced it in India for the nuclear industry there, originally. So it's all there. But he ends up dead, of course, in mysterious circumstances in 1997, as we'll see. And here's another one. Again, I've got a video clip, but this is about the Lutech free energy device. And this story surfaced in the early 2000s. On or about the, I think it was the 3rd of August, Cairns Post, North Queensland, carried a story, new magnetic electric device offers near free energy source. The inventors of this and developers of this device were Lou Britz and John Christie, who you see in the picture here. This device used a pulsed DC motor to induce an alternating current in the same coils, and this current is then used to power something else. And here's a news clip describing this and showing this.
Now to another good idea, and imagine a machine that could power your house for free. Well, that's exactly what two Australian inventors claim they've developed. Using magnets and a battery, their new generator has been described as revolutionary, and foreign investors are lining up for a piece of the action. Chris Allen reports.
So, John, this is the machine?
Yes, this is it, Chris.
What's it capable of?
Well, it'll power a house. The machine will provide sufficient electricity to run a house and have power to burn.
It sounds too good to be true, but inventor John Christie is convinced his machine will change the world.
So, John, basically you're saying this machine can produce 5 times as much power as it consumes?
Yes, it does. This one, exactly as we see it, it does. And in fact, it can produce more than that.
Once kick-started from a battery, John and his partner Lou Britz say this prototype will run for years without stopping, generating 24 kilowatts of power a day.
You don't get more revolutionary, I think. I mean, we're talking about something that has the capacity to change the way that the world produces its electric power. It has the capacity to change the way that cars are propelled. You can replace the combustion engine, in fact.
John, these are big claims. Are you sure you can live up to them?
We don't really need to live up to them, Chris. The technology speaks for itself.
I mean, a householder could buy one of these machines and install it in his garage and power his house forever without buying another kilowatt from a retailer. I mean, that's how serious it is.
Steve Brassington is an independent electrical engineer. He's seen the machine and backs up everything John says.
It's revolutionary. That's the only way to describe it. I think the technology, it's not bending physics, it's just using principles that I guess are commonly in use in power generation today in a different way. These guys have thought outside of the square.
Basically, it's magnetic attraction and magnetic repulsion that provide the movement or the moment of the motor.
Can you understand why some scientists are sceptical about it?
There is no physicist or engineer who has looked at our motor or has looked at our figures who says it doesn't work.
Lou is an electrician and John a businessman in Cairns in far north Queensland. The two unlikely inventors have been tinkering with their machine for 6 years. They've applied for an international patent and have been swamped by people wanting a piece of the action.
These are the coils. We mentioned the coils don't get hot.
Local businessman Alex Roma is one of the many offering money to help develop the generator.
If it proves up to be what they say it is, it certainly would be something I'd invest in.
John has also spoken to millionaire inventor George Lewin, the man who came up with the Triton workbench and who's now setting up a fund to stop Australian inventions going overseas.
There's an opportunity here, I think, to share an invention with the world that is beyond anything that we've ever contemplated before.
Scientists here at the local university say while they're interested in John's machine, they're also cautious. They say if the machine can generate as much power as John says it can, then they will have to rewrite some of the laws of physics. And they've urged people to be cautious about investing in it until the generator has been independently tested.
Anybody who says it doesn't work hasn't seen it or hasn't looked at our figures. They haven't reviewed it. If they look at it, they'll all agree with us that it does work.
John says the household generator should be available in a year and sell for about $5,000. If he's right, it will make him much more.
And how much do you think your technology could be worth?
I have absolutely no idea.
We could be talking about millions of dollars here?
Yes, very definitely talking millions of dollars, but I'd hesitate to even take a stab at it.
Good idea.
So, you might have noticed in that clip how he was fiddling with it with a screwdriver and he sort of cut the sparks and stuff. So that's a key element of that clip, because when that, I don't know what year that was, I think that was like 2003, 2004 maybe, that was clearly a prototype. And I actually went to see somebody who lived over near, where was it, Telford or somewhere like that, not 40 miles from where I live. And he was similar to this guy, he was a British guy, and he'd got something very, very vaguely similar to that. But you could only run it for 5 minutes, and then it would overheat, and he had to take it all apart and run it again. So if you want to know, if you've got a free energy generator, why aren't you running the house off it? That's why. Because that thing might have only run for like 5, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, and then it would overheat, and they'd have to take it all apart, replace some of the bearings or grease it or something, because it was a prototype. And to develop something like that that will run 24/7, you need precision engineering. And when you need that, that's when you have to go and look for money. And maybe you want to patent it. Well, if you listen to Tom Malone, who used to work in the US Patent Office, he said they used to filter out patents for national security. So any invention that was a threat to national security, that patent would be filtered out. That would go on some database, that patent would be denied. Whoever that inventor was would be on a watch list, because they would have invented something that was a threat to national security. That device would have fallen, in my opinion, into such a category. Some years ago I heard that his sister died in mysterious circumstances, and their website, Lutech, just disappeared. You can find it in the Internet Archive, you can go and look at it if you want, and draw your own conclusions about it. I draw my own conclusions based on what you're going to see in the rest of this presentation. Let's see if I can... Yes, what time is it now? I think we'll skip over this. So I've got a clip here, but I'm going to skip over this. You can find this online. John Bedini is now also dead. He died about 5 years ago, and his brother died, I think, the next day or something. That was very strange. But he was also using something vaguely similar to what you saw. He used a special type of motor where normally in a standard motor you've got a north and a south pole coming together in the commutator. But he used two norths. And he was able to get this situation where he was getting what's called a back EMF coming through one of the coils, and this would pulse. And during this back EMF pulse, he claimed that you were able to get a pulse from the radiant field and extract that and use it to charge a 12-volt battery.
Because as the system operates, it also captures and delivers usable energy.
We had a little trigger signal from this battery over here, and that starts the motor, which we're going to do right now. And if you come around to this side over here,
You can see over here, we'll slow it down a little bit. Over here, it's magnetically triggered on this side. Come over here. So each time one of these things goes around here, it puts a little trigger signal into these coils. And once we get the trigger signal in there, then what we can do is we can, each time this triggers, turns on and turns off, we can collect the charges that would normally be wasted. And of course they go into these banks over here, these capacitor banks, and then this is a timing mechanism here, which it's timed to be about once every second and a half or so, and makes contact here after we collect the charges. And then these capacitors here are dumped through this electronic switch here, and you can actually see the dump here. You watch it and it'll bounce up when it dumps. So if we slow it down a little bit so you can see it. See, it's bouncing around here. Each time that dumps down, the capacitor bank discharges into this battery. So this battery is going up. As this mechanism triggers here, these are coils. Okay, so the first thing that happens is it wants to repel the magnet like you see it doing here. Okay, it's because it's turning. But these are tri-Fowler wound coils, meaning that they work like a transformer, but it's not exactly a transformer because they're one-to-one. So the only thing that can go through this transformer is the radiant spike. And the radiant spike is collected in these condensers. And if we put the meter on it here, so you can watch it, you can watch how the spike is collected. You see? Goes up and down because it's charging and discharging. Now watch, we'll switch condensers. And this one will charge slower. See, and you won't see much of a discharge. When we move to this one over here, it charges much faster. When you hit that battery with the radiant energy, the battery takes the energy from the vacuum in the chemical process and converts it to something that's usable at a later time. In other words, it's a triggering mechanism. You have to trigger your circuits to produce a radiant spike, and then the radiant spike, when it hits the chemical action, sucks the energy from the vacuum. And that's what's charging the battery. Breaks it off. After radiant charger charges batteries, it's a little more difficult to charge with a conventional charger. Takes a longer time after that. So there is an alteration that takes place from using this form of energy that takes place in the chemical composition of the cells. And once it's attuned to this way of charging, the battery accepts the radiant charger much faster each time, higher power density output each time. So a 33 amp hour battery might look like a 65 amp hour battery. The difference is radiant's one form of energy, EM as we use today, electromotive force energy, isn't capable of charging this sulfated battery because it sees nothing. It sees an infinite resistance. Okay? Radiant energy doesn't, being that the energy is like 100 times or 200 times what the sulfation process is. Here, you can look at it again. Now it's brighter. See? And it'll keep doing that. The sulfation will come right off the plates. And the battery will become a pretty good battery again. You can see here that there's 8 magnets. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They're all North Pole. There is no South Pole. This motor does not switch back and forth. It's an attraction motor. It's not a repulsion motor. So every time that it's attracted in, it fires like a magneto. then the electronic circuitry decides to fire. But see, it's out of range when it fires. It's at like 23 degrees after. So when it fires this field, the field is big and pulls in the next magnet, and it repeats the same process. So we want to do this as quickly as possible. So you see one pole here, one pole here, one pole here, one pole here, one pole down here, one pole down here, and we want them all to fire at the same time. So if you look, all the magnets are lined up to fire at the same time in this direction, and then when the motor moves over here, all of them are lined up to fire in this direction. Once we do that, this is what we can do. Then we got a self-pulsing motor with torque. That's what the sulfation process is. Here.
So basically what he's saying is, this motor that he's got is like if you can imagine, it's like an electric motor and a dynamo at the same time. And so he's using this electric motor and a dynamo. The battery runs, one battery runs the motor, and then he uses the dynamo to charge the other battery. Right? That's basically what he's doing. It sounds incredible, but that's what he's doing. And if I go forward a bit in this presentation, if I can, see where it starts. Here we go. So this guy, as you'll hear, he's from like somewhere like Chorley or something like this.
Good day to you. I've decided to use the name for this particular experiment as Daft Man, because I must be daft to getting involved with this kind of thing in the first place. But after seeing a few videos on YouTube, I started to get a bit inquisitive and decided to go on, I'll have a go then. Let's see what all this hype is, whether it works or not. So here we go. I've actually got two coils. Don't know if you can actually see that. 22 SWG, 26 SWG and a 28 SWG, 500 turns. That's 500 turns, bipolar, I think that's what you lot refer to it as, on that coil, and the same on that coil. Now, as you can obviously see from what I've said and what I've just said, I've got three tapped outputs. One is the actual pulse, one would be the trigger circuit, and one is the generation circuit. But obviously the trigger circuit also generates power as well. Same with that coil there, exactly the same as what I've just described. Underneath, I don't really want to tip it up, but underneath, I don't know if you can actually see that, there's some magnets flying around. It's just tripping reed switches. So the only difference we mind is you've probably seen that capacitor at the back and wondering what that's for. Right, well the first motor, which is the drive motor, which is what I refer to it as, just so for clarity, actually drives, the outputs of those go down into the bridge rectifier, here, which then goes off and charges that capacitor. I should put my fingers too close to that, it's quite high voltage at the moment. Which then goes into the second trigger circuit, which is on that board at the back, that triggers that motor. So, the output of the two generation sides of that motor go into the rectifier, charge that capacitor, triggers the second circuit, then I tap the output off the second circuit into the next bridge rectifier, which then charges this battery. This battery's just come off charge this morning. It was about, I don't know, I think it's about 9-10 volts, and it's now charging, just to show you, that's the reading from that battery. It's now charging, it's actually, I've got to put some sort of regulator on, it's actually overcharging very slightly. It went to 14 volts a few minutes ago. But you can see 1381 there. The supply battery is 1198 solid, and that's the current it's actually using at the moment. So, for some unknown reason, mine keeps speeding up a little bit and slows down a little bit. I'm assuming it's when the capacitor starts using the current, and it just seems to do this sometimes. I don't know why, but sometimes I've got to look into it. Maybe it's just a bearing that's starting to wear or overheat. It has been running for, oh God, it's probably running for months now, non-stop, this has. I have actually got a little electronic circuit that I normally have on this that switches the batteries over. So when this one runs down to about 8 volts, it switches over to the next battery and swaps the charge over at the same time. So it just keeps swapping the battery, flip-flopping if you like, and keeps the whole thing running. The problem is, if you let the batteries run too low, and I've noticed this, if I let this battery here run down to about 2 volts, and then put a new fully charged battery on, which is what I normally use, a pair at the back there, and I let them charge up, I find that it doesn't charge that battery back up fully. So over a period of time, the whole thing comes to a grinding halt. If I reset the voltage detection for the switch circuit to detect the voltage drop at about 8 volts and then swap over, the thing will just run for months. I've actually had to stop it in the end because it's just getting on my nerves, running it back at the shed. So it's actually been running for many months, and I've only just finally plucked up courage to put it on YouTube, if you like.
So he had this act, he didn't reveal who he was called Daft Man. So you have to make your own decision whether that guy was faking it, whether he knew what he was talking about, what was he doing in that, what was he showing you. I think he was showing you a real working device where he was using one device to power a motor, and then that motor was recharging another battery. And like he said, when the battery discharged, it would swap over the batteries. So the charging battery then became the running battery, and it charged back the other battery. They said he had it running for months. Guess what?
You reverse the polarity.
Yeah, well, whatever. He was an electronics guy, he knew what to do. Now, the original Bedini clip, he didn't do that. He didn't do that. He said you could do that, but he didn't do it. Whereas that guy called Daft Man, he did it. He said he had it running for months. You could hear it, you could see it was a Heath Robinson device. It wasn't like precision engineered. That's why it would probably eventually wear out. But it worked. You can guess what happened to his shed, can't you? It caught fire.
So
and his website disappeared.
Purely coincidental.
Purely coincidental. Because he was an idiot.
So it's like an electromagnetic motor like that we know of, but it's picking up this additional...
Yeah, it's picking up an additional burst of energy at a certain point in its cycle.
And converting that radiant energy...
Converting that radiant energy into a pulse, which can then charge the battery back up a bit. Because you get that pulse like several times a second, you can recover that energy that's being used to drive the motor. That's what he was doing. And then we get onto the water fuel cell. I'll play the clip. So this uses a high frequency pulse circuit. Listen carefully in the clip from the Channel 4 documentary from 1995. And you hear him talk about high frequency pulses.
Well, it was during the embargo in the United States. It alarmed me that a little country over in the Far East could actually cripple the United States. And realizing that the entire industrial base of the United States and the world is based on the supply and the utilization of energy, it became imperative that we must try to bring in an alternate fuel source and do it very quickly. Of course, I thought originally with the right type of funding, we could possibly get it in within 6 months, but reality shows that the 12 to 15 years was more correct in this projection.
Back in the 70s, Stan Meyer set out single-handedly to solve America's energy problems. He decided to do it using water, the world's most abundant storehouse of hydrogen, which is a far more powerful fuel than oil. For 15 years, Meyer has been fighting to get his inventions taken seriously.
Most inventors have to be a loner. You have to be somewhat thick-skinned and don't rely on other people to support you, because they will not. More times than not, an invention is really stolen from the inventors. Even in my prior development of high technology, I've had patents taken from me. I learned from the School of Hard Knocks to be very cautious.
Meyer has always stood out against the crowd. He has no formal qualifications as a scientist because he didn't wait to graduate from high school, leaving early to go straight into research at the high-powered Battelle Institute in his native Ohio. Now he works full-time as a private inventor. He's built a device with potentially revolutionary implications. There is nothing startling about a machine that can extract the hydrogen from water. What is highly unusual is that it should do so with ordinary tap water. The conventional method is called electrolysis. Meyer has turned that process on its head. Unlike electrolysis, his device doesn't use up large amounts of electric current. nor does it produce an enormous amount of waste heat. For 20 years, he has been refining a method to fracture water, which produces vast amounts of hydrogen on demand. This is not his latest apparatus. He was unwilling to let us point a camera at that. This is the simple device he used to convince a reluctant patent office that his revolutionary concept actually works. Alloy rods, acting as electrodes, are housed in a perspex container that's filled with water. Normal mains voltage is fed in through a transformer, but critically, there is virtually no current consumed, less than half an amp. The result is dramatic. Hydrogen pours off with the flick of a switch. Meyer claims the key is his electronics, which pulses electricity rapidly across the rods at up to 20,000 cycles per second. In a way that's not readily apparent, this process transforms the equation. Whereas in conventional electrolysis, 3 times as much energy is consumed as is produced in the form of hydrogen fuel, in Meyer's apparatus, the reverse is true. It appears to produce several 100% more energy than it consumes.
Stan has something that's characteristic of the people that sound like they've done something to tap zero-point energy. Has high frequency, high voltage, and there's a combination of the two at which something occurs. With Chernetsky in Russia, it was what he called a self-sustaining discharge. The tube would run by itself. When Stan gets this effect, the amount of hydrogen and oxygen that are emitted off these 2 electrodes is a step function. It almost boils the water. If I did this with standard electrochemicals, I need current, and the water should rise a degree every couple of seconds. With Stan's, it'll run for a half hour, and the water temperature hasn't changed. Something's different.
Meyer demonstrates this repeatedly without any difficulty, and yet on the face of it, it represents an extraordinary revolution. His measurements over the years suggest 1,700% greater efficiency than conventional electrolysis. And, if he's to be believed, he's getting much better results from his latest, still secret invention.
Well, I first got involved with Stan Meyer when I went over there with a couple of colleagues to look at his water-splitting device. And so we arrived at Stanley Mayer. He had a demonstration cell. We filled it with tap water. In fact, I did that myself. And he switched it on, and almost instantly there were 3 jaws dropped because of the rate at which the gas poured off. It was quite spectacular.
Whatever energy source Stan Meyer had tapped, it was not explicable by the electric power that was going into it. So something was powering it outside of conventional wisdom.
There is no question that the gas coming off in such abundance is hydrogen. Meyer ignites it to produce a high-temperature flame able to cut through metal.
Stanley Mayer has faced a lot of difficulties. He's 3 times tried to launch the device and produce press conferences, had the technical press round, but he's been almost universally slated. In the early days, very much so, they just ridiculed the whole idea. He's getting a little more notice now because some scientists are getting interested. But by and large, science is very intolerant, particularly modern science.
As with Tesla, Griggs and others, Meyer's claims are so far outside the received scientific wisdom that they've been ignored by the majority of the scientific establishment. But then, Meyer has ignored them too. He has poured his energies over the last 10 years into establishing recognition for his claims by getting international patents.
In the processing, there was a great deal of difficulty in trying to process the legal paperwork in such a way as to allow the Patent Office to fully understand what was actually occurring. In one instant, we brought the water fuel cell to Washington, D.C., and of course I had tweaked it in such a way to produce an enormous amount of hydrogen and oxygen gas, and the patent examiner said, no, it will not work based on the electrolysis process. And when we turned it on and produced an enormous amount of hydrogen and gas, the examiner finally realized that we were doing exactly that, and went out in the hallway and started screaming and hollering to everybody on the floor, put out all your cigarettes, hydrogen's in the building. So we started laughing and said, well, we certainly convinced everybody in the patent office that we can do what we said we can do.
Even so, the US Patent Office dragged their feet for 3 years before granting patents on the hydrogen-producing device. Since then, against massive resistance, he's managed to get patents established throughout Europe and Japan. But the hydrogen machine was only the first step towards Mars' ultimate dream. If he gets it right, this application of his technology would change the 21st century in the same way that the Wright brothers and Carl Benz transformed the 20th. He is currently modifying a beach buggy to run on nothing but water. It doesn't have a petrol tank or even a hydrogen container. It has just a tank of water. He's invented a device called a water splitter to replace the spark plug. As the water is injected into the engine, Meyer claims it's fractured into hydrogen and oxygen and then burned as fuel. Meyer is working on a kit to modify any engine. He hopes to demonstrate it on this car within 12 months.
And of course, the blessing to the use of the water as a fuel source, that on combustion, the byproduct is water mist. So we're even solving the environmental pollution problem at the same time that we're using water to maintain the industrial basis of the world.
Meyer is protective about his inventions to the point of self-confessed paranoia. Most observers describe him as a crank and his car as an aberration. If only a fraction of what Meyer claims for his technology can be achieved, it would represent a vindication for NASA's involvement. It would also be a powerful threat to many entrenched vested interests.
If Stan Meyer's device works like he advertises, you would make energy available universally almost free. That is a major, major, major impact.
When new technology comes in existence, there's a great resistance to it because it can affect a lot of economic factors. In this particular case, in the United States, we pay out roughly about $200 billion a year for foreign oil. It's quite obvious that the Arabs would pay $200 billion to try to keep this type of technology out of the economy. And many times over the last decade, I have been offered enormous amounts of money to simply sell out or to sit on it. The Arabs offered me well over $1 billion cold cash simply to sit on and do absolutely nothing with it. My life has been threatened many times. Of course, I happen to believe in the power of angels. And if I don't believe in the power of angels, I don't believe I'll be around here too long.
So, well, you'll find out what happened to Stan Meyer later. Now, I'm not going to play this clip because this is basically another version of Meyer's technology. I think you can probably still find versions of this clip. I'll just play the very start of it.
Turn the machine on. Turn the machine on. Denny Klein fires up his hot new invention. His machine emits a flame that feels only slightly warm to the touch. But watch what happens when he touches anything else.
Instantaneously, I can burn a hole right down through the center of that brick.
The flame instantly turns hotter than the surface of the sun. Heat so intense it takes only seconds to literally burn a hole through charcoal. 3 seconds turns a brass ball to glowing liquid metal. Tungsten lights up like a sparkler. Steel, lead, and other metal slices on contact. Yet the tip of the welder stays cool to the touch.
No other gas will do this.
Denny Klein uses an alternative fuel source once thought impossible. He says people still have trouble believing him when he reveals his liquid fuel.
Water. Take water and electricity, and we break it down through our very unique electrolysis process.
Klein has just patented his process of converting H2O to HHO.
Very similar to Meyer's cell. Totally different implementation, or totally different device at the end of it. Another device that's come up in sort of various bits of research is what's called MEG, the Motionless Electric Generator, by Tom Bearden. He's designed this. I've looked into this a bit. I read a very good electrical assessment. It's kind of one of these things that looks like it might work, but actually probably doesn't. So not all of these things that you find on the internet really work. Some of them might appear to work, but they actually don't. But others definitely do work, in my opinion, my conclusion. So I've shown you various things now. Why, again, don't you know about these things? Why haven't we got them in general usage? I've made a few hints. You've seen bits and bobs. But why, oh why, would anyone want to cover up cheap energy sources, particularly now with all this talk about climate change and burning fossil fuels and CO2, which is all just meaningless, unscientific nonsense, which I cover in my climate change book extensively. How can this be covered up? Surely it's just a tinfoil hat, crazy, nutty, whack job conspiracy theory, which is the sort of language you'll hear pretty much anywhere outside this room. And as really said in that clip earlier on, energy industry is the biggest global industry of all. It's multi-trillion-dollar industry. Oil, gas, coal mining, they're all huge prospecting, extensive, expensive operations, and the vested interests are enormous across many sectors. That's one reason to cover it up. Even governments need energy to run everything. Even medium to large scale use of more conventional technologies such as basic electric cars and conventional battery technology, well, that was terminated a few years ago. Now we've got Tesla and stuff, but I think that's only come about because they've got the technology to implement the control grid. In other words, the sort of always on internet that we've got. If you watch a film called Who Killed the Electric Car, which was about a car called the EV1, which was developed in the 1990s by General Motors, they didn't have the control grid infrastructure then. And I think that's why they killed it back then. Now it's different. They do have this.
The academic government complex, not the military-industrial complex, as much as the academic government complex, is against new scientific ideas that threaten the foundations of their work. And no matter how many papers are published, I don't care whether they're on the internet or not on the internet or where they are, the establishment, academic, government complex is brain dead.
I mean, why can't they open their arms and say, this is exciting, let's try it, let's experiment, and let's jump in it?
Well, it's remarkable. I must tell you, George, 15 years, almost 15 years now, after that fateful day of March 23rd, 1989, I continue to evolve in my understanding of the emotional and psychological and intellectual armoring, to borrow a term from the famous Wilhelm Reich, that scientists have. It's astounding. One physicist at MIT, whose name is Dr. Hermann Feshbach, one of the world's foremost nuclear physics people. Now he's deceased. But at MIT, as I was finishing up my time there as a senior person in the MIT News office as a science journalist, he had played a role in getting rid of a major article that was of mine that was going to appear in the MIT magazine, a very influential magazine called Technology Review. It's on newsstands all over the place. He said to me, I've had 50 years of experience in nuclear physics, and I know what's possible and what's not possible. And then that was it. That was his total statement, which I would cite forever as a statement, a kind of statement that should never come out of the mouth of any person who considers themselves a legitimate scientist. They're not a scientist if they say, based on previous knowledge and theory that I have, I know for all time what is possible and what's not. That's obviously crazy.
So, as you can see there, Dr. Mallard was murdered on the 17th of May 2004, apparently in a bungled burglary. There is actually a YouTube video going into some quite rather sadly gory details of his death. That was published, I think, about a year or 18 months ago. And, the timing of that death was quite suspicious. But allegedly this was some bungled burglary done by, two guys that were, known criminals or something. I don't know what to think, but I understand at the time, just a few days before he was murdered, a few days after he was murdered, he was due to give a presentation to some senators or a group of politicians about new energy and free energy research. So, how is this done? The CIA operates, this is from the earlier clip that I played with Bruce Palmer and showing the clip of Ed Mitchell and Dewari and the M machine. The CIA operates through various innocent-looking fronts to find out what people are thinking and what they're inventing. Now, what's more innocent than the benign institute founded on transcendental principles to help new age inventors bring free energy into the world? Oh, Edgar Mitchell. Well, funnily enough, he founded IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is still going. But then he also founded in 2008 this thing called Quantrack. I only found out about this not too long ago. And there's a website in the Internet Archive. It no longer is online, but you can find some snapshots in the Internet Archive. And this says, for example, membership opportunities. And this is to, you can see, engineering the best possible future through frontier science, which is like, very vague, of course, but they were talking about developing free energy devices, such as the things like the MyoCell and stuff. The 0 Point Forum, there, right there, that's suggested what I've told you about, isn't it? The 0 Point Forum is an international scientific consortium restricted to scientists, scholars, theoreticians, academicians, authors, science writers and journalists. Dues start at $150 per year. So they want to charge you, get your membership, so they know who you are. You're going to give your name, you're maybe going to give a credit card number. They're going to know who you are if you join this Quantrack organisation. And then it says, the Board of Trustees. The Board of Trustees is open membership to individuals who contribute $10,000 or more per year to the work of Quantrack, who take or make a one-time major or planned gift of $25,000 or more. The Board of Trustees is comprised of major philanthropists, high net worth individuals, celebrities, VIPs and persons of prominent stature. It organises guilds at the community level, publishes a quarterly magazine, sponsors an annual black tie ball and gala. Does it really? What's that got to do with free energy research? That was Edgar Mitchell's, he had his name on this slide.
It's amazing how you can self-fund a thing to silence people, and they're funding it themselves, aren't they?
That's right. Let's put the light on so I've talked about Greer, I mentioned him already. He did this disclosure project. He made the connection between free energy and UFOs for me. But Stephen Greer, he produced this website called Seize Power. I think that came online around about the time the Disclosure Project came online in 2001. It was mid-2001 when this Seize Power website came online around then. And let's see. So here is an old archive entry of the Seize Power website. And the idea behind this was Greer says, look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this website, this group called Seize Power, and I'm going to get all the people with lots of money, they're going to write to me and they're going to fund the inventors. So I need to get a list of inventors that have got these free energy devices like Stan Meyer, the Lutech device, all of this, and then I'm going to get these philanthropists to fund their research. Right? So you develop this website, Space Energy Access Systems. And there you go, you've got home, about us, latest news, strategic overview, YCs, energy papers, related news, blah blah blah, contact us. That was in 2001. And then I kind of followed that for a bit, heard nothing. And then in 2007, Greer says, I'm announcing this new website, it's called Aero 2012. And it's got down the side here, home, about us, latest news, award programme, strategic overview, why Aero. So you can see it says YCs, why Aero, an overview for inventors. And it says an overview of over-unity reactor generators. And it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same. So he'd taken in all this money between 2001 and 2007, and all he'd done is done a new website. That was it. That's all he'd done. Same website, same paper, same content, no discussion of any free energy technologies that had been developed by him or funded by him or brought forward by him. There was nothing. And then he did it again. He did the same thing again with the Orion project, which was registered on the 30th of November 2007. So the Aero 2012 website disappeared, and it then became Orion project, and then it became the Sirius Technology and Research Initiative. He did it about 5 times. He did the same trick. Stephen Greer, this guy. And then he later admitted working for the CIA. Now, in a separate thread, Greer claimed to know somebody, or claimed to have testimony, well, he didn't claim, he does have testimony from Denise McKenzie that Science Applications International Corporation were involved in the black budget programs to do with the reverse engineering, flying saucers, crash discs, and all of this.
And these meetings I had with Senator Goldwater have now been confirmed by the release from the Goldwater Library in the last month, back in March, about these meetings that I had with him. Now here's the pièce de résistance, is that after this discussion, he started asking me, he says, well, who have you been briefing on this? I said, well, you know, I briefed President Clinton's team and his CIA director, R. James Woolsey, and I've met with the head of the head investigator for the Senate Appropriations Committee. I've met with, and I went on and on. And he says, well, what are they? I said, well, they were in the same boat you were in, Senator. This kind of secret collegium of folks running this hadn't told them a thing. And that even when the president made inquiries, they wouldn't tell him anything. And when the CIA director made inquiries, they wouldn't tell him anything. Because it is so secret. And so if you look at me, he says, well, who is involved in this secrecy? So I started naming some people that I had learned from very reliable sources were members of this so-called Majestic Committee. It used to be called back in the Truman and Eisenhower era. And one of them was Admiral Bobby Ray Inman. And Admiral Inman had been head of the National Security Agency, but before then had been deputy director of the CIA. But at that time had gone to the board of directors of Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC, which is a huge government contractor that has dealt with some of this stuff. And he says, so when I started naming different names, he didn't know some of them, but when I landed on Admiral Bobby Ray Inman, he says, oh, I know Bobby Ray, I've known him for years. And I said, well, Senator Goldwater, would you pick up the phone and give him a call and see if we can meet to see if we can get some cooperation on making a change and disclosing this information, bringing this science and technology out so we can get out of Mideast oil and we can make a civilization here that works and that is free.
So my point in playing this clip is that Greer knows about this company called Science Applications International Corporation. He knows that they've got something to do with energy and UFO cover-ups, right? He knows that, and that's what he was speaking about with Senator Barry Goldwater. You can find clips of him talking about the Blue Room at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where they've got all the alien technology locked up, according to him. But what you're going to learn, and if you read Dr. Wood's book and you look at her website, this company, Science Applications International Corporation, they were defendants in Dr. Judy Wood's court case, which was about them covering up what really happened on 9/11. Okay? So we go on. Now, Greer says in his book, Forbidden Truth, Hidden Knowledge, he says on page 157, unfortunately right now the worst elements of humanity currently possess these free energy technologies, or that's, I'm paraphrasing there, these technologies meaning advanced free energy technologies. When people worry about these technologies being disclosed, I say, forget it, the worst elements already have them. That's what he says in his book, right? But then listen to this. So Stephen Greer was giving a public presentation, I forget the date, I got the date on here, I forget the date, I've got the date somewhere, it wasn't that long ago, this was about 2016, something like that, 2017, and there was a guy in the audience who I've corresponded with for several years, his first name's Alan, and he asked Greer about 9/11.
Yes, sir.
There's compelling evidence that not just the towers, but the entire World Trade Center complex was destroyed by perhaps a directed energy type of something that was operated under the technology of molecular dissociation. That seems to be very much related to what you're talking about. Have you looked at that?
I have looked at it. You know, I have bigger fish to fry. 9/11 was terrible. We lost 3,000 people. It led to 2 huge wars and trillions of dollars. I will tell you this. get to specifics. I mentioned a gentleman named Richard Foch, third highest guy, Richard Foch at the Naval Research Labs. He was in meetings with the then Vice President of the United States, Cheney. And he said absolutely it was known about in advance and there was involvement at that level. And he told me, and I have witnesses, multiple witnesses to this, that if he were to speak of this, now he's passed away, that he, his wife, his children, and his grandchildren would all be killed. That's all I'm going to say on the 9/11 issue. But there is a lot to that story. I've never shared publicly what I just said, but the man has passed away. So it's not hard to, and I think most people get into these grand conspiracy theories. Basically, all you have to do is stand down. There's a constant threat. There is terrorism out there. And you don't even have to host an event in that case. You just have to stand down the systems that would have intercepted it. You understand what I'm saying? So it's like when you're doing a code blue, boom, clear. You say clear before you do the electric shock. So you just clear the system, let it come in and hit. Now, what I think happened on 9/11 is more like what I just described. And I have very good reason to believe that, because someone of that integrity and rank had a front row seat and knew about it. And I've never spoken of this before right now, but I think that it's disturbing. It's enraging, but it's a minor rounding error compared to what's coming if we don't end this cartel's hegemony on the secrecy related to UFOs, ETs, what have you. 9/11 is going to be a very minor blip on the screen. So that's my warning to people. You can take it or not. But I've known what you just asked about since it happened. My whole security team lit up like you would believe when that happened. Yes, yes, ma'am.
So that's really, really interesting clip. Because the question that the guy, Alan, asked was basically, what do you know about directed energy weapons being involved in the destruction of the World Trade Center? Which is the one thing that Greer did not include in his answer. He talked about 9/11 and knowing about stuff, but he says right at the end, so that's my warning. And he also says, I've known about what you just asked about since it happened. So he's admitting that he knew that directed energy weapons were involved in the destruction of the World Trade Center. He's known that since it happened. Yeah, he's talking about UFOs, but he doesn't talk about SCIC there. So to me, that means that he's working for the CIA and he's helping to cover up the link between free energy technology and what happened on 9/11. And he's not the only one. This guy is also involved. I've got a chapter in my first 9/11 book about this top guy who's called Tony Craddock, who's an oil industry consultant. He helped get my first YouTube channel taken down. Sterling Allen. Now this guy, he started up a free energy database thing. It's a really interesting site. I think it's still going. Lots and lots of interesting stuff on there. Lots of interesting stuff. Welcome to PESWiki, the community-built resource that focuses on alternative, clean, practical, renewable energy solutions. As of Wednesday, March 2nd, 2016, there are 5,864 articles on free and renewable energy that anyone can edit. And I met this guy, I met him in 2012, and Dr. Judy Wood, who wrote that book, met him in 2012. We met him in the Netherlands. Here he is. Let's see. Now it turns out that he's friends with Stephen E. Jones, the guy I mentioned earlier on who said that thermite was used to destroy the World Trade Center. He knows Jones, he describes him as a friend. And we've got this clip of him talking about Jones, which was in this talk here with Dr. Judy Wood in 2012. And I did another talk. But it turns out that he's a paedophile, and he was arrested in 2016. And the incident that he was arrested over was actually related to somebody that John Hutchison knew. I think I mentioned earlier on. What are the chances? In other words, this backs up this, and then again it ties into QAnon, which talks about the world being run by a network of paedophiles, or they're used, paedophiles are common in positions of power, and I think that's correct. I think that part of the QAnon theory, whatever you want to call it, is true. At least that part, probably a bit more. Oh yeah, everyone heard of UK Column? And you might have heard of BCG, the British Constitution Group. Well, I had a run-in with these guys, curiously enough, in 2012.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Roger, for letting me speak. My name is Michael Clark. I am a retired scientist, physicist by profession. So I have an inherent interest in energy systems, and in particularly alternative energy systems, which have been hidden from us, deliberately. Now, a person better qualified than me to speak about new energy devices and how they were suppressed is Andrew Johnson, who I will introduce in a moment. But I will say this final thing. We are currently working on fuel devices that are classed as over unity. In other words, more energy out than in. We should have something by 2015 that will allow every individual that's part of the BCG or Lawful Bank to install a unit into their homes and derive free electricity. You will never have to be on the grid. Thank you. Thank you. We haven't done it yet, but we hopefully will do it. Everything's looking very, very positive at the moment. All the results we've had so far have been positive, and I'll keep all members of BCG through Roger and his newsletter up to date on what's going on. Now, the key element of having a device like that, whether it's going to be magnetic or a water fuel cell, which are some of the things we're working on, the key element of having a device like that is that we can offer it to non-members as an incentive to join Lawful Bank and British Constitution Group. Who in their right mind is going to turn down a unit that's going to give them free electricity? Nobody. So what a great carrot to swell the membership. Come join us. We'll make sure you get one of these things. You will never have to pay electricity again. You can come off the grid. We don't want to give it back to them because we don't want anything to do with them, to be perfectly honest. But it's a great incentive, and it's a good way of swelling our numbers.
I'm going to call a close to the meeting, gentlemen.
Well, before you do that, Mike, could I just ask if there's any, because you mentioned previously, I was curious that you'd been involved with some water fuel cell development a few years ago. And
yeah, about 5 years ago.
I just wondered if there's any, so obviously if anybody with experience like that can be fed into this process. I mean,
not really.
Why would that be?
Because the tank cell is a much simpler and I think much more efficient way of moving forward, rather than trying to do high frequency electricity and pulsing it and messing around with it until you get exactly what you want.
So you're saying then from that development your experience was that you were using this...
It produced gas, but not very efficiently.
Right.
Yeah, I think we were using 1.7 volts and 200 milliamps was our input current, and we were producing gas from a standalone cell. Very much like Myers, that he shows on his papers and his videos.
Was that your goal to sort of reproduce the Myers cell?
My goal today...
No, sorry, then. At
that point it was purely an experiment.
Right.
It was purely to, what's this all about? Let's have a look at it. We built it and it worked. After a fashion. That's not what I want to do.
Right, was this
WFC is just a means to an end here.
Yeah.
We're looking for the most efficient way, whether it's WFC or not. It doesn't make no difference what the method is, as long as we achieve the desired result, which is to provide energy for people for free.
So in your opinion then, from that development previously, you think that was sort of...
No, it's not a way forward.
Right.
I don't think you could produce sufficient gas in quantity to drive the motor, to drive the electricity generator.
Right.
This has the tank cell is far better.
And was that you and a good group of guys, or was it?
Yeah, it was just about 3 or 4 friends.
Right.
We just got together, and lots of things we were doing at the time, not just WFC, lots of stuff. We built a little magnetic motor that was continually running, but not producing an awful lot of energy. But it was working on its own without any further input. But I think the tank cell has got the better possibility of actually achieving what we want to achieve quickly.
So what he was saying there was, in that first clip he says we've nearly got a device without having it done by 2015. Then when I went to that meeting, he was saying that he'd already got a working device, a magnetic motor that was running, but it couldn't be used for this later one. No, he was lying. He was making stuff up in front of 500 people. And I was roped into this. I was asked to join it. Nothing came out of that group, and it was later discovered that this Mike Clark was a fraud. He'd had charges for fraud in the past. And he didn't even have a degree, apparently. He made various claims about... He said to me that he would have studied with a chap called Sir Fred Hoyle, who's a very famous astronomer. In fact, Sir Fred Hoyle came up with the alternative theory to the Big Bang. It's called the steady state theory, if you want to do some research into that. And this Mike Clark guy came to claim to know. And Mike Clark approached me. He came to me at a meeting in Birmingham in 2012, and he tried to rope me into this free energy group. That meeting was the only one I went to. I knew it was... They were just checking people out. They were checking out who was doing what. And a guy called Oliver Smith came to that meeting. And it was him that suggested that tank cell circuit, which I showed on the screen. And Mike Clark was saying, oh yeah, we're going to develop that. Even though Oliver Smith said this wasn't necessarily anything that would work. Mike Clark had something that worked, according to him, but that wasn't really developed. So why would he develop something that doesn't work instead of developing something that did? It doesn't make any sense. So, I think you're getting the picture now. Wilhelm Reich found dead in his prison cell. He wasn't hanged, actually. I need to change that slide, I keep forgetting. Bruce Palmer, dead in 1997. Stan Meyer died in 1998. Eugene Mallove, 2004. James Black, on 1st of August 2003. He was a Nobel laureate for medicine. He tried to help out with John Hudson's research, and he died of a heart attack in mysterious circumstances. Ari M. de Geus, he died on the 11th of November 2007. He was the inventor of a revolutionary self-powering battery of the AMDG Scientific Corporation. He was found slumped in his car, totally unresponsive, in the long-term parking lot of the Charlotte Airport, I think. Michael Zieber, he was a student of Dr. Judy Wood. He was the nephew of William Zieber, who worked with Eugene Mallove. He was about to tell Dr. Judy Wood about his connection to cold fusion, and he was murdered in the street in 2006, much to the shock and horror of Dr. Judy Wood, who was his supervisor. So I think you talked about that. Stan Meyer was poisoned after a meal with 2 Belgian investors, and he actually said, I'd been poisoned, and so you can read about that story. His brother reported that story. And then, so, following this plan, I don't agree with all of this, but I'm going to read it out. Stanley Meyer and many others, always the same story. The Pentagon wants to see your idea, tell you how they would like to use your invention. You demonstrate your device, proving to them that it works. Then they block all of your efforts and end up killing you. The only way to get a free energy device out to the public is to forget about the patents, distribute underground, sell it to EV enthusiasts with plans, and encourage them to travel around and do as you are. Then you have created a non-interlinked underground distribution system that will spread to the general populace, and it will spread like wildfire. It will be unstoppable. Well, I think you can only do this ideologically, because if you want to produce a working device, you need machine shop skills. You need an engineering production line. You need precision engineering to make these things work. Because yeah, you can get them to work, but like the Yildiz device, which you can learn about from Turkey, you can run it for an hour, then it will overheat, and you have to take it all apart. It wears out, you have to do something to it. That's the way these things work. Okay. This is what happened on 9/11. This is 70 stories of unsupported steel turning to dust before your very eyes. There are many clips of this. This is all explained in Dr. Judy Wood's book. What technology can do this? This wasn't plane crashes that did this. Look at this. This building here on the left, if I can get my pointer on again, that building there, that's World Trade Center number 7, okay? World Trade Center number 7 was a 47-story steel frame building. That was destroyed at 5:20 in the evening on 9/11. Fact. Look what's here. This is the remains of these. These were 210-storey buildings. And this is taken at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, judging by maybe between 12 and 2. Oh, but the steel was shipped to China, Andrew. Really? All this was shipped to China in, let's see, 4 hours?
Scrapmen.
Hmm?
The scrapmen were around.
Yeah, they were quite quick, weren't they? Getting these, 500,000 tons of steel on the boats.
Believe it was
between 10 and 2. That's about maybe 1-2 stories high. That's an 8-storey building. That's what it is in relation to the towers. You've got all that material turned to dust. That was done with planes, with thermite, with explosives. Really? Is that a building exploding, or is it turning to dust? This is all in Dr. Jingle's book, or if you don't want to buy the book, just look at the website, go through the slideshows which I put on there. Watch the videos. This was technology at work, folks, precision technology. Everything was turned to dust in the towers. Not everything. About 90% of the towers was turned to dust. But all this paper, what happened to this? Paper didn't turn to dust. Why? Well, because of the selective effects on materials. Look at this car here. This tyre's inflated. This one's gone. This looks like a brand new paint job. What's happened here? How did this supposed car fire burn all of this, but not this? And look at this. Oh, Andrew, oh no, you're wrong about these cars, because what happened is they were towed. So they caught fire at the World Trade Center, and all the fire burnt that down. Then they caught fire, and then they towed all these cars to another location. Really? Did they? Well, how about this parking lot? A quarter of a mile from the World Trade Center. If you look at these carefully, you perhaps can't see it at the back. These cars have been toasted in place. You can see some of these cars. This red one's okay. No change. These cars are completely rusted. And this is over the space of about 4 hours. How is that possible? It's because there was an energy at work here. And the energy had interference patterns, the pattern of the energy, and that's what's in Dr. Wood's book. She explains all of that. So these cars we know were not towed. They were toasted in place. They were toasted, they were history. Okay? I've got a little 5-minute video about this where I zoom into this image and you can see it all right there. Unburned paper here, raging car fires only a few inches away. Are these real fires? Are they real hot fires? Maybe they turned into real hot fires at some point, but they weren't real fires here. This tree is not on fire. This paper's not on fire.
And they found that pilot's passport on all that paper as well, wasn't it?
Forget that. That's just information. That's just disinformation. So, John Carpenter made that film. There was an interview with him published, I think, in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, might have been even later than that. And he described that film, They Live, was actually a documentary, not a science fiction film. Make of that comment what you will. So, basically that's it for tonight. Hopefully you can see the thread of thought that I've put into that to show you why you don't have free energy technology. Sadly, I've been talking about things like the connection between 9/11 and free energy since 2008, 15 years, 14, 15 years, but yet hardly anybody else is talking about it. There's a few people talking about it now, but there are still many free energy research groups. They're not going to get anywhere because the people that destroyed the World Trade Center, they call the shots. I don't know who they are, but somebody in Science Applications International Corporation, they know who did 9/11. They know who did it. And there's another company called Applied Research Associates which are involved as well. That's all on drjudywood.com. Right? And the SEIC came to our website. I've got website tracks from 2008, 2009. They came and looked at our website. So, and Raytheon did as well, which is another big US. What are they doing? Poking around on my website. Why would they want to look at it? Perhaps because what we've told you is true. Anyway, that's it, folks. I'd like to thank you for coming along and listening and for your support. I really appreciate it, and I'll take any questions that you may have. I know it's late, so thanks again for your stamina. Okay.
just out of pure curiosity, I mean, you mentioned right at the end there that you've, you know, the kind of military-industrial complex are checking out your website. Have you ever had any visits from Men in Black at all?
Not exactly. What I did, I mentioned, I put a copy of the letter in my 9/11 book. It's on my website. In 2008, I basically decided, I think it was October 2008, when I was sort of aware of most of what's here, in pretty much this form, I took it upon myself that I would write to all the army bases that I could find and all the RAF bases that I could find on the internet. So look, whatever you're doing, you guys, you need to find out what happened on 9/11, because frankly, those are the real enemies. They've got technology which is way beyond anything you've got, and you can find out about that by, you know, looking on Dr. Judy Wood's website, right? And I've put various links in and stuff. I sent it to the police as well. I sent it all to the police, slightly different version to them. I sent to the same letter to army bases and RAF bases. I just sent it. I didn't make any threats or anything like that. I just said, look, go and check this out, guys. You know, frankly, I think whatever else you do in the military, you're wasting your time. Honestly, you really are. You need to go and check this out. And that's basically all I said, you know, some details. I didn't say anything else. And then it took them a while, but in February, I got a knock at the door, and two guys were there. My wife answered the door, actually, my wife at the time answered the door, and she said, oh, there's two policemen to see you. I said, oh, really? What's that? So I came down, said, come in, do you want to have a cup of tea? Two plainclothes guys, and they started talking to me and said, oh, get straight to the point, Mr. Johnson. I've come about these letters that you've written. I said, oh yeah, well, what's the problem? I said, well, are you going to write any more letters? I said, well, you know, if I've got anything else to say that I might, but it's all in the letter, everything's explained. And he says, oh, you know, it's very well reasoned, very well argued. Yeah, well, that's because the facts are there for anybody that wants to go and see them, you know. And he said, oh, you're just exercising your democratic right to free speech, aren't you? I said, yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. And I said, would you like to have a DVD of, you know, my presentation on all of this and why I've come to these conclusions? And he said, oh, yes, please. I thought he'd say no, but I got him the DVD because I was still doing the DVDs at the time. And then he took it. They were there about 10 minutes, and then he went. They drove off. And now, they claimed to be from Derbyshire Police, but I don't think they were. They did flash a police ID with the, you know, the sort of star thing. I forget what they call that thing that police have on their helmets. But it wasn't. It just looked like a generic one. I didn't really quiz them on that. I was a little bit, slightly nervous, as you might imagine. I wasn't that nervous. And I never heard from them again. But what I did notice when they were there, he had a copy of the letter that I'd sent out. It was a photocopy because I'd sent it on a colour printer. I'd also told them about Hurricane Erin, which I didn't cover tonight, but that's in my books and everything. And Hurricane Erin's movement on 9/11. You need to find out about Hurricane Erin's movements on 9/11 if you don't know about that already. Because it's very relevant to all this bogus nonsense on climate change.
Erin spelled how?
E-R-I-N, the girl's name. Many hurricanes are named after girls, as you may be aware. So I put that in the letter as well. And when the guy was sat in my lounge, he had this on his lap, and he had the version that I'd sent to the military, not the police. That was what was interesting to me. Because I knew that I'd slightly different versions. I sent one version to the police, and a slightly different version to the Army and the Air Force. And he had the one that I'd sent to the Air Force, which made me think, he's not police, he's come from like military intelligence or military police or something, you know. And obviously I hadn't done anything wrong, so he couldn't do anything to me. And he seemed a bit bemused. I think they would just come to my house to see what sort of person I was. Was I some crackpot? You know, was I some, you know, did I come with a joint in my mouth or something, you know, to the door with a joint in my mouth, or was I off my head or something like that, you know. I think that's all they came for. Because they couldn't do anything, they couldn't argue with anything. You know, and that was it. So that's really the only thing I've had, really. There was another time, not really to do with this. In fact, I can tell you two other little things. And I think I've put these on my website anyway. One time, when I'd sent some letters out, a guy from the Daily Telegraph phoned me, called Duncan Garden, and he was wanting to quote me in an article, and he said, let me go through some details after I'd talked to him for about 5 minutes, and he said, yeah, your name's Andrew Johnson, you work for the OU, yeah, blah, 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 and your wife is a nurse. And I said, yeah. And I thought, how does he know that? he shouldn't have known that. According, I don't think there's any information that I put publicly that said my wife was a nurse, which was true. I don't know how he knew that. And then there was another time when it wasn't really a visit, but it was an interesting response. A group of us got together because you remember in 2007 they were beating the war drums for Iran, and some British sailors got captured and taken into Iran, and they were paraded on TV and all of that. We wrote to the press about them because we knew what they were doing. They were trying to start a war with Iran, and we basically told them that, and we told them why we were pretty sure that was the case. There's a group of about 20 of us. Now, I got a response from Peter Beaumont, who's a foreign affairs editor of the Observer newspaper, and I presented all these facts to them about all these stories that they put in the press about the Iranians doing this. Those British sailors, they were deliberately sent so that the Iranians could capture them. That was a set-up job. And we proved to them with the facts that they published, which were incorrect, that that was what they were doing. Guess what Peter Beaumont's response to me was? It was, F off, you sad little loser. That was his one-line response to the facts that we'd given him. And said that we knew what they were doing, we knew that they were trying to start a war or conflict of some kind with Iran, so just stop doing it, because we know what you're up to. And that was his response. He couldn't challenge any of the facts that we'd sent to him. Right? So, there you are.
Response like that. Yeah. I think there's no doubt that this free, very cheap energy does exist. You say it can only exist like theoretical at this time.
No, it's real.
Well,
what I mean, what the point is actually getting a device to extract that is not easy. To make it reliable and usable is not easy. Sorry, carry on.
Well, even if it was, it wouldn't be allowed.
Correct. Well, you've seen the examples. Sorry, Chris, carry on.
Yeah. No, I think that's the point. That we can only provide water. We can only.
We've got the breadcrumbs.
Yeah, we've got it. We know. Yeah. We've got no doubt, and but we can't operate it.
No.
Yet in this world at this time,
and I think
it's
my feeling, which might be wrong, is that until people in the free energy community that know that this stuff works, acknowledge what happened on 9/11 and talk about it publicly and apply pressure to the academic institutions to acknowledge what happened on 9/11, nothing is going to change. And I felt that way since I knew for sure that this is what happened on 9/11. That's not a theory.
Very
That's
interesting what Stephen Greer says, because it seems to me like, I don't know, it's just a theory of mine, because I've watched this talk of yours before, is that he's made a choice that he's got no choice but to sort of, for his own survival, to go along with having to...
And I go into some of the reasons for that, what you've just said, in my Acknowledge book. Right? Because there are certain facts I didn't have time to include tonight about Stephen Greer, which are revealed in his own book.
So he's not necessarily a bad guy.
Not necessarily, but he's playing a certain role, and that I explain in the Acknowledge book.
Okay.
And he's not the only one that's like that. Sorry.
No, I'm just curious. Do you think that the whole 9/11 thing is directly connected to Project Bluebeam?
Maybe. And what I say to people, and I've said this several times since 2012, and I'm not really the first to say this part, really. If you look at what I showed you tonight, you can see that the World Trade Center was destroyed using some sort of energy.
It looks like it's been incinerated.
Right. That's a fact. Right? It's not a theory. Anyone that says that it's a theory has not looked at the evidence, or is trying to misdirect, or is being dishonest. Okay? And I've been saying that publicly for 15 years. I'm still here. And I'm still going to say the same thing because I know that it's true. Right? That's one part of it. So, if an energy weapon was used to destroy the World Trade Center, which was what happened, what were the planes? So I'm now getting to answer your question. What were the planes? We've come to the conclusion, based on Richard D. Hall's research and several other people, quite a number of other people, that those planes were not real physical planes. It was some sort of image projection technology. You can call it hologram if you like. I just tend to call it image projection. And they look like real planes. Let me finish the point. So they set up this show in 2001, World Trade Center turns to dust, after planes crash into it. Those were not real planes. There was some sort of image projection. Possibly there was a missile involved, at least one of them, but we're not sure. I've got another clip. In fact, I can play you the clip if you want. I can probably find it. Let me find it, and then you'll see what I'm on about. Has this gone on to...
Is it long? Because I'd like to bring it to a close.
Not very long. It's about a couple of minutes. So let me just try and find it. If it's really not long